Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere most of us would never survive. A place where your breath crystallizes before it leaves your lips. Where the temperature doesn't just drop below freezing, it plummets to 30, 40, sometimes 50 degrees below zero. We're talking about the Rocky Mountains in winter, the 1820s through 1840s, when men who barely owned two shirts somehow made it through nights that would kill you or me in under 3 hours. Picture this with me for a moment. You're crouched beside a fire that's somehow still burning despite wind that cuts like broken glass. Your back is already numb from the cold pressing against it. The firelight flickers across a landscape so white and endless it hurts to look at during the day. But it's night now. Deep, absolute night. The kind of darkness that swallows sound. You're wrapped in animal skins that smell like smoke and old blood and something wild you can't quite name. Your fingers ache even inside beaver fur mittens. And you absolutely know that if this fire goes out, you might not see morning. This was just Tuesday for mountain men. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our little community spread across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The question we're exploring isn't just historical curiosity. It's existential. How did these men, often barely educated, sometimes half drunk, usually underfed by modern standards, survive conditions that kill experienced climbers today? What do they know that we've completely forgotten? Historians at the University of Wyoming studied journals from the fur trade era and found something startling. Mountain men regularly endured temperatures and exposure that modern survival experts consider unsurvivable without advanced gear. We're talking weeks, sometimes months, in conditions that would empty a modern REI store in panic. Here's the strange part. These weren't superhuman specimens. They got sick. They complained constantly in their journals. Some were in their 50s, which was genuinely old for that era. And yet they survived, night after frozen night. So what changed? Why would you or I, comfortable, well-fed, probably wearing more advanced materials right now than they had in their entire wardrobe? Why would we die where they merely shivered? The answer isn't simple. It's woven through everything from metabolism to psychology, from forgotten techniques to knowledge we've traded away for central heating. And tonight, we're going to unravel it all. Slowly, gently, one frozen night at a time. Because understanding how they survived might just reveal how much we've lost in our journey toward comfort. Let your breathing slow. There's no rush. We have all night. And unlike those mountain men, you're perfectly safe. Warm. Protected. Let that safety wrap around you like the buffalo robe we're about to discuss. Your body right now is a traitor. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, insidious way that would have gotten you killed 200 years ago. Let's start with something simple. Your thermostat. The one on your wall. Right now, it's probably set somewhere between 68 and 72 degrees. Your body has spent your entire life, every single night, expecting that temperature. Your metabolism has calibrated itself around that expectation, like a spoiled houseplant that dies the moment you forget to water it. Mountain men didn't have that luxury. Their bodies expected nothing, and that made all the difference. Modern studies from the University of Alaska Fairbanks examined metabolic rates in indigenous populations versus urban dwellers. The findings were stark. People who live without consistent heating produce up to 30% more body heat at baseline. Their mitochondria, those little power plants in your cells, work differently, more efficiently, like they're always idling at a higher RPM. Your mitochondria, statistically speaking, are lazy. They've never had to work hard because you've never truly been cold. Not the kind of cold that lasts. Not the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there for months. Here's where it gets interesting. Brown fat. You've probably heard of it. It's that special tissue that burns calories to generate heat rather than storing energy like regular white fat. Babies have lots of it. Mountain men had lots of it. You probably have almost none. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation found that just 10 days of cold exposure can increase brown fat activity by up to 40%. But here's the thing. Mountain men lived in that exposure constantly. Their bodies were furnaces compared to ours, burning hotter on less fuel. Meanwhile, your body has gotten so comfortable it's forgotten how to shiver properly. Yes, properly. Shivering isn't just random muscle spasms. It's a precisely coordinated thermogenic response. Small muscle contractions generating heat without much movement. Mountain men could shiver so subtly you wouldn't even notice, maintaining core temperature while appearing almost still. Your shivering, by contrast, is violent and inefficient because you've never trained it, never needed to. There's also the question of circulation. Your extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears, they're the first things your body abandons when it gets cold. Blood retreats to your core to protect vital organs. That's normal. But mountain men had developed what physiologists call peripheral adaptation. Their blood vessels and extremities could constrict less severely, maintaining enough circulation to prevent frostbite while not hemorrhaging heat. It's a delicate balance, one their bodies learned through years of exposure. Yours never had to learn. Then there's something historians rarely discuss: pain tolerance. Not just physical toughness, though that mattered, but actual neurological differences in how cold registers as discomfort. Chronic cold exposure appears to reduce the sensitivity of peripheral nerve endings. Mountain men's fingers could go numb without triggering the panic response that floods your system with stress hormones. Those stress hormones, ironically, make you colder. They increase muscle tension in all the wrong ways. They accelerate breathing, which means you're exhaling more warm air. They cloud judgment. Your body, faced with serious cold, essentially panics itself into worse danger. This had learned that panic was more lethal than the cold itself. So they stayed calm, methodical, even as frost formed on their beards. There's a debate among anthropologists about whether these adaptations were genetic or purely acquired. Some argue that men of Northern European descent had slight advantages. Others insist it was entirely about acclimatization and lifestyle. The truth, as usual, probably lives somewhere in between. But what's certain is this: every generation that lives in climate-controlled comfort loses a little more of that capacity. Your great-great-grandfather could probably handle cold better than you, not because he was tougher in spirit, but because his body simply knew how. And that knowledge, written in metabolism and circulation and nerve response, has been bred out of us, traded away for thermostats and central heating and the ability to wear shorts in January. Was it worth it? That's not for me to answer. But on a frozen mountain at midnight, with a fire burning low, the question would have answered itself. Feel your warm blanket, your comfortable mattress. Let yourself sink a little deeper. Because unlike those mountain men, you'll never have to find out what your body might have forgotten. There's a reason buffalo almost went extinct, and it wasn't just for their meat. Imagine wrapping yourself in a blanket that weighs 20 pounds. Sounds miserable, right? Like sleeping under a stack of textbooks. But that weight was everything. A full winter buffalo-robe, taken from an animal in its prime, usually November or December when the coat was thickest, could measure 7 feet by 8 feet. One continuous piece of hide with fur still attached. Sometimes 2 inches of dense, oily hair covering leather thick as your thumb. Mountain men paid between $10 and $15 for a prime robe in the 1830s. That's roughly $400 in today's money. For a blanket. But calling it a blanket is like calling a rifle a stick. The technology woven into these robes took millennia to develop. Buffalo evolved in the Great Plains where winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Their fur isn't just thick, it's architecturally brilliant. Each hair has a hollow core. Microscopic air pockets running the length of every single strand. Thousands of individual insulation chambers. Dead air space trapped at the molecular level. Modern sleeping bags try to replicate this with synthetic fills and down feathers. They come close, but they miss something crucial: the weight. That 20-pound robe didn't just insulate, it anchored you. In wind that could literally blow a modern tent into the next valley, that robe stayed put. Draped over a sleeping man, it created a microclimate that could be 30 or 40 degrees warmer than the air 6 inches away. The Lakota and other Plains tribes understood this better than anyone. They had a whole vocabulary around buffalo robes that we've lost. Different words for robes taken at different seasons. Special terms for robes from bulls versus cows. Specific names for robes that had been smoked or painted or worn for years until they'd molded to someone's body. Mountain men learned this language. They had to. Your life depended on knowing that a cow robe from December was worth twice what a bull robe from March would fetch. Not for trading purposes, for survival purposes. There's a journal entry from Osborne Russell, a mountain man who trapped throughout the Rockies in the 1830s. He describes sleeping through a blizzard that killed 3 of his horses. Just him and his partner, wrapped in buffalo robes, snow accumulating over them until they were completely buried by morning. They woke up warm. Historians argue about whether accounts like this are exaggerated. Some insist that frontier riding was prone to tall tales and masculine posturing. But here's the thing. The robes still exist. You can find them in museums. Pick one up, if they let you, and you'll understand immediately. The weight, the density, the way the leather side feels almost waxy from years of accumulated oils and smoke. No synthetic material has ever matched it. Not Gore-Tex, not Thinsulate, not aerogel, or whatever NASA's currently developing. Because we've been optimizing for lightness, for packability, for moisture wicking and breathability. All things that matter if you're hiking 10 miles a day. None of which matter if you're sleeping in one spot for 14 hours in sub-zero darkness. The mountain men weren't hiking. They were surviving. And survival meant staying put under something heavy enough that the wind couldn't find you. There was also a psychological component. Something we've completely lost. The smell. Buffalo robes smelled like smoke and animal and weather and earth. They smelled alive, comforting in a primal way that our odorless synthetic fabrics can't replicate. When you pulled that robe over your head, you weren't just blocking cold. You were entering a space that felt ancient, protected, like crawling into a den. Some mountain men kept the same robe for years, a decade or more. The leather would darken and soften until it moved like fabric. The fur would develop bald patches and wear patterns, but never stopped working, never lost its insulating properties. Try that with a modern sleeping bag. 5 years of hard use, and the synthetic fill starts clumping. The zippers fail. The waterproof coating flakes off. We've engineered everything to be replaceable, disposable. Buffalo robes were meant to last longer than the men who used them, and often did. By the 1880s, the buffalo were nearly gone. Millions killed, some for robes, more for the hide trade, most just for sport or to starve the Plains tribes into submission. And with the buffalo went that knowledge. That perfect insulation technology refined over 10,000 years of evolution. We replaced it with factories and petroleum products and planned obsolescence. Is our gear lighter? Absolutely. More convenient? Without question. But would it keep you alive through the kind of night that Osborne Russell described? That's a different question entirely. Feel your blanket right now. How much does it weigh? 3 pounds? 4? Could it stop wind? Could it shed snow for hours and still keep you dry? Would you trust it with your life? The mountain men did, every single night, and the buffalo robes never betrayed them. Let that weight sink into your imagination. That ancient animal warmth, as you drift deeper into your own perfectly regulated comfort. There's an art to getting dressed that we've completely forgotten. Not fashion, survival. Mountain men didn't throw on a parka and call it good. They built themselves, layer by careful layer, like constructing a fortress from the inside out. Let's start at the skin. Closest to your body, you'd wear a linen or cotton shirt. Sometimes, well, if you could afford it. This wasn't for warmth, not directly. It was for moisture management before anyone used that term. Your body sweats even in freezing temperatures, especially when you're chopping wood or hauling water or doing the 100 small tasks that kept you alive. That first layer absorbed the moisture, kept it away from your skin where evaporation would cool you dangerously fast. Mountain men would sometimes wear the same shirt for weeks, until it was stiff with salt and smoke and old sweat. Then they'd wash it in a creek, if there was open water, and immediately put it back on wet. Sounds insane, right? But wet linen against skin actually insulates better than dry linen in certain conditions. Something about water's thermal properties. Historians at the Museum of the Fur Trade have studied surviving garments and found they were rarely clean by our standards. But they were strategically dirty. The oils and residue actually improved their performance. Over that shirt came buckskin, deer or elk hide, brain-tanned until it was soft as cloth. A proper buckskin hunting shirt reached mid-thigh, long sleeves with fringe along the seams. That fringe wasn't decorative. Well, not just decorative. It acted like tiny gutters, channeling water away from seams where leaks would develop. The buckskin itself was remarkable. Brain tanning produces leather that stays soft even when wet. Modern leather gets stiff and brittle. Buckskin just dries out and returns to its original texture. You could sweat through it, freeze it solid overnight, and thaw it by your fire the next morning without damage. Try that with your Gore-Tex jacket. Over the buckskin came wool. A heavy coat or capote. That's what they called those blanket coats. Usually red or blue, made from Hudson's Bay blankets. Thick wool that had been fulled and compressed until it was nearly waterproof. 3 or 4 pounds of felted wool draped over your shoulders. The capote had a hood, which mattered more than you'd think. Heat loss through your head isn't the myth people sometimes claim. Your head is maybe 10% of heat loss, not the 50% that urban legend suggests. But 10% matters when you're operating on the edge. So the hood stayed up. Always. Even indoors if there was any draft. Now here's where it gets interesting. Between these layers, mountain men created air pockets. Dead airspace. The same principle as modern insulation, but achieved through fit and drape rather than synthetic fill. The linen shirt hung loose. The buckskin was cut generously. The capote draped open unless you cinched it tight. Those gaps between layers trapped warm air that your body heated. 3 thin layers with air between them beat 1 thick layer every time. Modern outdoor companies have rediscovered this principle and act like they invented it. But mountain men knew it in their bones. Literally. On their legs, they wore buckskin leggings. Not pants, leggings. Separate pieces tied to a belt, one for each leg. This seems primitive until you think about it. If one leg got wet crossing a stream, you could replace just that piece. If you ripped a knee, you patched one legging, not an entire garment. And the gap at the crotch, covered by the long shirt, provided ventilation, prevented overheating and the sweat accumulation that could kill you later. Over the leggings, sometimes came wool pants, but often not, because bulk around your legs made it harder to ride horses, harder to move quietly, harder to dry your clothes by the fire at night. They prioritized function over coverage. On their feet, the layering continued. First a wool sock, then a liner sock of lighter wool or linen, then moccasins with the hair side turned in during winter. Sometimes they'd stuff the moccasins with grass or cattail down for extra insulation. The whole assembly was wrapped and tied with leather thongs. No laces to freeze and snap. No buckles to break. Just leather cord that could be replaced with a strip cut from any hide. There's a letter from Jim Bridger, one of the most famous mountain men, describing his winter outfit. He estimated he was wearing about 30 pounds of clothing and gear on a normal cold day. 30 pounds. You probably weigh about the same now as mountain men did then, around 160 pounds average. So they were carrying 20% of their body weight in insulation. Modern backpackers try to keep pack weight under 20% for comfort. Mountain men wore that much just to survive, standing still. But here's the crucial part we've lost. They knew exactly when to add layers and when to shed them. They'd strip down a shirt and leggings before heavy work. Layer up immediately when stopping. Swap damp inner shirts for dry ones during lunch breaks. open the capote to wint heat before they started sweating. It was constant adjustment, constant attention. We've replaced all of that with zippers and vents and moisture-wicking fabrics, with the expectation that our gear will self-regulate. It doesn't really, but we've forgotten how to do it ourselves. Some anthropologists argue that this layering knowledge came primarily from Native American practices, that mountain men were just adopting indigenous technology. There's truth to that. But mountain men also brought European wool and linen into the equation, creating a hybrid system that combined continental textiles with frontier practicality. The result was something neither culture had alone: a layering strategy so effective that men survived winters in the Rockies wearing what amounts to fancy pajamas by modern standards. No zippers, no Velcro, no synthetic anything, just dead animals, plant fibers, and 10,000 years of human ingenuity wrapped around mortal flesh. Let yourself feel the single layer you're probably wearing right now. A t-shirt maybe, or nothing at all, because your room is 70 degrees. And that's enough, but only because you've never needed more. Let's talk about the one thing that separated life from death. Fire. Not just any fire. A fire that stays lit through wind that would extinguish a blowtorch. Through snow falling so thick you can't see your hand. Through nights so cold that metal snaps like glass. Mountain men could do this. Consistently. You probably couldn't. Not because you're weak or incompetent, but because nobody taught you the 50 small details that matter. Start with wood selection. Not all wood burns the same. You know this intellectually, maybe, but mountain men knew it in their hands. Pine burns hot and fast. Good for getting warm quickly or boiling water. But it spits sparks and runs through fuel like you're feeding a dragon. Oak and hickory burn slow and steady with almost no smoke. Perfect for an all-night fire when you need consistent heat more than dramatic flames. But they're hard to ignite and need serious coals underneath to catch. Cottonwood, which grows along rivers where mountain men often camped, is almost useless. Burns cool, produces mountains of ash, and goes out if you look at it wrong. But when it's the only option, you learn to make it work. You split it fine as pencils and feed it constantly through the night. Then there's moisture content. Dead standing timber beats fallen logs every time. A tree that died on its feet and stayed dry through seasons is worth 10 freshly fallen trees. Mountain men could spot dead standing wood from 100 yards. The bark pattern, the way branches broke, the sound it made when you knocked on it with your knife handle. They'd take an extra hour to find the right tree rather than settle for damp wood. Because damp wood doesn't just burn poorly. It produces smoke that gets in your eyes, your lungs, your clothes. It hisses and steams and wastes energy evaporating water instead of generating heat. In really cold weather, the moisture in wood freezes. Ice in the grain. That wood won't burn at all until it thaws, which requires heat you don't have yet. So mountain men would split wood down to the dry center, or carry pieces inside their shirts to warm them with body heat before adding them to the fire. Starting the fire was its own art. Flint and steel, you've seen it in movies probably, looks easy. It's not. You need char cloth, which is cotton fabric that's been partially burned to create material that catches the tiniest spark. Mountain men made char cloth in batches, storing it in waterproof pouches usually made from animal bladder. That pouch lived next to their skin. Always warm, always dry, because damp char cloth is just cloth. Useless. You strike the flint against steel, catching the spark in the char cloth. Then you transfer that tiny glowing ember into a bird's nest of tinder. Not just any tinder. The finest, driest material you can find. Inner bark from dead cedars, shredded until it's practically dust. Or dry grass, crushed and fluffed until it's mostly air. You blow on it gently. Not hard. Hard blows scatter the ember. Gentle breath, feeding oxygen without disturbing the structure. The tinder smokes, then glows. Then, if you've done everything right, bursts into flame. That whole process can take 30 seconds on a good day, or 10 minutes on a bad one. In wind, you do it inside your coat or under your buffalo robe, creating a microclimate where your breath and ember can commune without the whole world interfering. Modern lighters make this seem quaint, but lighter fluid freezes at around 0 degrees. Butane stops vaporizing below 32 degrees. Even fancy windproof lighters fail in real cold. Mountain men with flint and steel had no such limitations. Rock and metal don't care about temperature. They work at -40 as well as they work in summer. But starting the fire was just the beginning. Keeping it alive through a blizzard-required architecture. You built a reflector wall behind the fire using logs or stacked rocks. This threw heat back toward you instead of letting it radiate into empty space. Some mountain men built elaborate reflector systems that could double the effective warmth of a small fire. You dug down through snow to mineral soil, if possible. Snow underneath the fire melts and puts you out. Or you built a platform of greenwood, wood too wet to burn, as a fire base. The platform chars and smokes, but doesn't combust. Keeps your fire elevated above the snow. You created windbreaks, walls of snow or stacked pine boughs or leather stretched on frames. Not to block all wind, you need some oxygen flow, but to deflect the worst gusts and create a pocket of relatively still air where flames can climb without being blown horizontal. There's a technique called the long fire that almost nobody uses anymore. You lay 2 logs parallel, maybe 6 inches apart. Then you build the fire between them. The logs themselves eventually catch and burn from the inside out, creating a long trough of coals that radiates heat evenly for hours. You can sleep alongside a long fire and stay warm all night with minimal tending. But it requires logs of specific size and moisture content. Too small, and they burn through. Too large, and they never really catch, just char on the surface. Jim Clyman, who trapped with Jedediah Smith in the 1820s, wrote about maintaining fires in storms so severe they couldn't keep their eyes open. Working by feel, feeding wood into flames they could barely see. Some historians question these accounts. They seem superhuman. But then you find archaeological evidence at old campsites. Fire pits dug 3 feet deep with elaborate wind baffles. Char patterns on rocks showing where reflectors stood for weeks. The physical proof of techniques we've forgotten. There's also the question of coal keeping. When you had to move camp, you couldn't necessarily start a new fire from scratch. Flint and steel are reliable, but they're not fast. And in truly awful conditions, freezing rain, for instance, they might not work at all. So mountain men carried fire with them. A buffalo horn filled with rotted wood and coals from last night's fire. The punk wood smolders for hours without flame, barely needing oxygen. You blow on it when you make camp and coax it back to flame. Or you wrap coals in wet bark, which insulates while providing just enough oxygen to keep them barely alive. An ember can survive 12 hours like this. Traveling fire, literally carrying warmth from yesterday into tomorrow. We've replaced all of this with matches and lighters and the assumption that starting fire is easy. It is easy now, but on a frozen mountain at midnight when your fingers don't work right and wind keeps killing your flame and your life depends on getting warmth in the next 10 minutes, mountain men didn't panic. They just worked through the checklist written in muscle memory and hard-won knowledge. Flint, steel, char cloth, tinder, kindling, fuel. Reflector, windbreak, platform, patience. The fire always came. Eventually. And when it did, it felt like the most important thing in the universe. Because it was. Feel the warmth of your room right now. Constant. Reliable. Requiring nothing from you. Let that ease sink deeper. As you imagine the alternative. The cold. The desperation. And the small, precious flame that stood between men and oblivion. A tent is not a shelter. Not really. It's a compromise. A membrane between you and whether that traps some heat while letting most of it escape through fabric and seams and zippers that never quite close all the way. Mountain men understood this, so they built differently. Let's start with the simplest structure that actually works. The lean-to. You find 2 trees about 8 feet apart. You lay a ridgepole between them, lashed with leather cord or propped in the fork of branches. Then you lean branches against that ridgepole at a 45-degree angle. Cover those branches with pine boughs, overlapping like shingles, thick side down. 3 layers deep if you can manage it. The whole thing takes maybe an hour if you know what you're doing. And it's not waterproof, not completely, but it doesn't need to be, because you build your fire 6 feet in front of the opening. And behind the fire, you build that reflector wall we talked about earlier. Now you've created something remarkable. The lean-to's angled back catches radiant heat from the fire and reflects it down onto your sleeping position. The reflector wall behind the fire bounces heat forward. You're sleeping in a cone of warmth between 2 reflective surfaces. On a 20-degree night, the temperature inside your lean-to at sleeping level can reach 50 or 60 degrees, all from a fire that's technically outside your shelter. Modern campers don't build like this anymore. They pitch tents designed to be weatherproof and retain heat. But those tents only retain body heat, which is fine if you're in a good sleeping bag. Not fine if you're wrapped in a buffalo robe that works better with external heat. The lean-to system lets you sleep warm with less insulation because you're supplementing body heat with fire heat. It's counterintuitive. An open shelter feels like it should be colder. But physics says otherwise. Radiant heat transfer beats conductive transfer when you set it up right. Then there's the snow cave. This one sounds insane until you try it. You find a drift deep enough, at least 6 feet, and you start digging. Not just a random hole, a carefully engineered space. You dig upward and inward, creating an entrance tunnel below the main chamber. The tunnel acts like a cold sink. Cold air is denser than warm air, so it flows down and out through the entrance while warmer air rises into your sleeping chamber. The sleeping platform needs to be higher than the entrance, at least 2 feet higher. This creates thermal stratification. The coldest air pools in the entrance tunnel where nobody sleeps. The relatively warmer air stays in the main chamber. We're not talking about hot air, maybe 35 degrees when it's 0 outside. But that 15-degree difference is everything. The snow itself is insulation. Compressed snow has an R value. That's insulation efficiency, comparable to fiberglass. Not as good as modern foam, but remarkably effective. And snow doesn't conduct wind. A snow cave in a 40-mile-per-hour gale is perfectly still inside. Silent, like being underwater. Mountain men used snow caves when they had to, when storms were too severe for fire, when they needed to hunker down for days. You could keep a tiny candle burning inside a snow cave and gain meaningful warmth from it. Try heating a modern tent with a candle. The heat goes straight through the fabric, and you've accomplished nothing except wasting wax. There's a journal entry from a brigade of trappers caught in a late spring blizzard in 1832. They dug snow caves and survived 3 days while the storm killed hundreds of buffalo on the plains around them. Just men in holes, waiting it out. Some historians suggest these accounts conflate multiple events, that memory and storytelling exaggerated the danger. But the technique remains sound. Snow caves work. Even today, survival schools teach them as last resort shelters. Though most modern people would panic in one. The claustrophobia, the darkness, the awareness that you're buried under tons of snow. Mountain men found it cozy. For longer-term camps, they built more elaborate structures. Log shelters with dirt roofs. Think half cabin, half cave. You'd find a hillside and dig into it, creating a space maybe 8 feet deep. Then you'd frame the front with logs, leaving an opening for a door covered with hide. Roof it with more logs, then a layer of bark, then a foot of dirt. The earth itself becomes your insulation. 3 feet underground. Temperature stays relatively constant year-round. Not warm exactly, but stable. 40 degrees when it's minus 20 outside is survivable luxury. These earth-berm shelters required real work. Days of construction. But trappers who worked the same region year after year would maintain them, coming back to the same camp every season, finding their shelter still standing, still dry, ready to protect them again. There's an archaeological site in Wyoming where researchers found remains of a shelter used intermittently for nearly 30 years. Same basic structure, repaired and reinforced, but never abandoned. Multiple generations of trappers use the same hole in the same hillside. Because once you've built something that works, you don't start over. You maintain. The French-Canadian voyagers had their own variation. They'd build a windbreak from pine boughs arranged in a horseshoe shape. Then they'd sleep feet to fire with 5 or 6 men in a row. Body heat from 6 men sharing space adds up. And if you're sandwiched between 2 other men with a fire at your feet and a windbreak at your back, you stay surprisingly warm. This required trust. Real trust. You're literally depending on strangers not to roll over and smother you or steal your gear while you sleep. But in winter camps, that trust developed. Had to develop, because the alternative was freezing alone. Modern camping culture emphasizes personal space and individual shelters. Everybody in their own tent. Privacy and comfort. But that individualism has a thermal cost. 2 people in one shelter are warmer than 2 people in separate shelters. 6 people in one shelter are dramatically warmer than 6 individuals. Mountain men knew this. They slept in piles when necessary. No shame about it. No weird masculinity that prevented men from sharing warmth. Survival doesn't care about your personal space. There's also the question of shelter placement. Not just finding any flat spot and calling it camp. You needed protection from wind. That was obvious. But you also needed to avoid certain places. Valley bottoms where cold air pooled. Exposed ridges where wind never stopped. Anywhere near dead, standing trees that might fall in wind. Anywhere under heavy snow loads on branches. Mountain men developed an eye for reading landscape. A slight rise that put you above the cold sink, but below the wind. The south side of a hill where you get morning sun. Near enough to water that you could fetch it, but not so close you'd hear it all night. These considerations sound minor until you've spent a night in the wrong spot. Then you understand why they mattered. Why experienced trappers could look at a valley and know immediately where they'd camp while greenhorns picked terrible sites and suffered needlessly. Let yourself imagine it now. That lean-to, fire crackling in front of you, the angled roof reflecting heat down onto your buffalo-robe, wind moving through trees 50 feet away. But where you are, in your small engineered pocket of warmth, the air is still, almost calm. Your modern bed is better, of course, more comfortable, more reliable, but in some ways less interesting, because your bedroom required no thought, no understanding of physics and weather and the subtle geometry of heat. You just turned on the heat, and it worked. Like magic you don't have to understand. Your body is a furnace, but only if you feed it the right fuel. And modern diets don't. Not for real cold, not for survival. Mountain men ate fat. Not as a guilty pleasure or occasional indulgence, as their primary calorie source, the kind of fat that would make a modern cardiologist weep. Rendered bare grease eaten by the spoonful. Buffalo marrow sucked straight from cracked bones. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat pounded with fat until it was 50% animal grease by weight. This wasn't ignorance. It was sophisticated nutritional science learned through trial and fatal error. Fat contains 9 calories per gram. Protein and carbohydrates contain 4. In conditions where you're burning 5,000 to 7,000 calories a day, just staying warm and functional, that difference matters enormously. You can't eat enough lean meat to sustain yourself in serious cold. Your body can't process protein fast enough. There's actually a condition called rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. Early explorers who ate nothing but lean game literally starved to death with full stomachs. Their bodies couldn't convert protein to usable energy quickly enough. They needed fat, desperately. Mountain men understood this instinctively. The fattiest parts of any animal were prized above all else. The tongue, marbled with fat. The hump of a buffalo, thick layers of fat over the shoulder muscles. The tail of a beaver, almost pure fat, considered a delicacy. They'd render fat from any source and store it in containers made from animal intestines or bladders. That rendered fat went into everything. Pemmican, obviously, but also mixed with dried berries for a high-energy traveling food. Stirred into whatever stew or soup they were making. Eaten straight when nothing else was available. There's an account from Osborne Russell describing a meal that consisted of roasted buffalo ribs where the men ate primarily the fat layer, discarding much of the lean meat. To modern sensibilities, that sounds wasteful and disgusting. But they understood their bodies' needs better than we understand ours. The lean meat would keep. Could be dried into jerky. The fat had to be consumed while fresh or rendered immediately for storage. So they ate fat first. Always. Your body processes fat differently in extreme cold. It doesn't just burn it for calories. It uses it to maintain cell membranes that stay flexible at low temperatures. It converts it to brown fat, that special tissue we talked about earlier. It produces hormones that regulate body temperature. Modern research from the Arctic has shown that indigenous populations consuming traditional high-fat diets have metabolic advantages in cold environments. Better temperature regulation, more efficient energy use, improved mental clarity in conditions that would fog most people's thinking. Mountain men accidentally discovered what scientists are now proving: that cold weather survival requires different macronutrient ratios than temperate living. Your modern diet is probably what? 30% fat at most? Maybe 40 if you're keto conscious? Mountain men ran closer to 60 or 70% fat during winter. Their bodies were metabolizing like Arctic animals, like bears preparing for hibernation, except they never got to hibernate. They just stayed in that high-fat, high-burn state for months. There's also the question of ketosis. When your body runs primarily on fat instead of carbohydrates, it enters a metabolic state where it produces ketones. These are incredibly efficient fuel for your brain and muscles. Mountain men probably spent most of winter in mild ketosis, not by choice or dietary philosophy, just because carbohydrates were scarce. No bread unless they traded for flour at a fort. No sugar except occasional wild honey. A few roots and berries dried from autumn, but not many. Mostly just meat and fat. Their bodies adapted, became efficient fat-burning machines. Your body, by contrast, expects regular carbohydrate intake. It's adapted to 3 meals a day with reliable starch and sugar. Drop you into a mountain man's winter diet and you'd feel terrible for weeks. Sluggish, foggy, weak. Your metabolism would eventually adapt, but you'd suffer during the transition. They never had a transition. They just lived there. Pemmican deserves special attention. It's possibly the most efficient survival food ever developed. Take lean meat, buffalo, elk, deer, whatever. Dry it completely until it's brittle. Pound it into powder. Mix it 50-50 by weight with rendered fat. Add dried berries if you have them. Saskatoon berries were favorites. Pack it tight into leather pouches or animal intestines. The result is shelf-stable for years without refrigeration. Pound for pound, it contains more calories than almost any food known to humans. A single pound of pemmican could sustain a man for a day of hard travel. Not comfortably, not ideally, but sustainably. Modern militaries have tried to replicate pemmican's efficiency. MREs and energy bars and survival rations. They come close on calories. But nothing matches pemmican's combination of caloric density, stability, simplicity, and the specific macronutrient profile needed for cold weather exertion. Some historians argue that pemmican was primarily a Plains Indian invention that white trappers simply adopted. That's absolutely true. But the genius was in the adoption, in recognizing that indigenous food technology was superior to anything European tradition offered for these conditions. Early mountain men who insisted on eating like they did back in St. Louis or Pennsylvania, trying to live on hardtack and salt pork, died. A lot. Those who survived learned to eat like the Lakota or Shoshone or Blackfoot, to crave fat the way they craved it, to understand that grease wasn't dirty or primitive but essential. There's a darker side to this too. The obsession with fat contributed to the slaughter of certain animals. Bears were killed not for their hides, but for the thick fat layer they carried into hibernation. Beavers were trapped partially for the fat in their tails. Buffalo were sometimes killed just for the tongue and hump, with the rest left to rot. This wasn't sustainable. Obviously, the ecological cost was catastrophic. But in the moment, for individual survival, it made perfect sense. Fat equaled life. Everything else was secondary. Modern nutritional science has spent decades demonizing fat. Low-fat diets, fat-free products, the idea that dietary fat creates body fat, which isn't really how it works. We're only now rediscovering what mountain men never forgot. That fat is essential fuel, that your brain is largely fat and needs dietary fat to function optimally, that cell membranes throughout your body require specific fatty acids, that hormone production depends on cholesterol from animal sources. Mountain men didn't know any of this biochemistry. They just knew that fat kept you alive when nothing else would. And they were right. Feel your comfortable body right now, fed on balanced meals and regular snacks. Never truly hungry, never burning calories so fast you can feel yourself getting colder. That's luxury. Real, profound luxury. Built on grocery stores and refrigeration and the assumption that food will always be there. Mountain men had no such assumptions, so they ate fat and survived. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people who die of hypothermia don't freeze to death. They panic themselves to death. The cold gets into their head before it gets into their core. And once fear takes over, physiology follows. Mountain men had something modern survival training tries desperately to teach, but rarely succeeds. Absolute psychological acceptance of discomfort. Not tolerance. Not endurance. Acceptance. The difference matters enormously. When you tolerate cold, you're fighting it. Your mind is screaming that this is wrong, dangerous, intolerable. Your body responds to that mental stress with physical stress. Elevated cortisol, increased muscle tension that burns energy without producing useful warmth. Rapid breathing that expels more heat than it provides oxygen. You're making yourself colder through the sheer effort of hating how cold you are. Mountain men didn't fight the cold. They just lived in it, like you live in room temperature. You don't spend mental energy being grateful for 70 degrees or resisting 68 degrees. It's just the ambient condition. That's how they approached 30 below. It simply was. This sounds impossible until you understand the training, though they wouldn't have called it training. Young men who went to the mountains for the first time usually went with experienced trappers, and those first winters were brutal, not because the weather was worse, but because the psychological adjustment was enormous. You had to learn that being uncomfortable wasn't the same as dying, that you could be cold, genuinely bone-deep cold, and still function, still think clearly, still make good decisions. Most modern survival situations involve people who've never been truly cold before suddenly finding themselves in it. The shock is psychological as much as physical. Mountain men lived through that shock in a somewhat controlled environment with mentors who kept them alive while they adjusted. By their second or third winter, the fear was gone, replaced by what journals describe as a kind of calm fatalism. There's an entry from James Clyman talking about a night so cold that his breath froze in his beard and he couldn't open his mouth without pain. He describes this the way you might describe a traffic jam. Annoying, worth noting, but not frightening. Modern psychologists have studied this phenomenon in extreme athletes and military personnel in Arctic environments. They call it stress inoculation. Repeated exposure to manageable levels of a stressor gradually increases your tolerance and reduces your psychological response. Your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, literally becomes less reactive to cold as a threat. Mountain men underwent extreme stress inoculation whether they wanted to or not. Every night reinforced the lesson. You can be cold. You will survive cold. Cold is not an emergency, just a condition. There's also the question of sleep. Modern people in cold conditions often can't sleep. The discomfort keeps them awake, and sleeplessness creates its own cascade of problems. Impaired judgment, reduced physical coordination, increased perceived pain. Mountain men slept through conditions that would keep you wired with adrenaline, not because they were more tired, though they probably were, but because they trained their nervous systems that sleep was safe even when uncomfortable. Think about your own sleep habits. You probably need the room at a specific temperature, your pillow at a certain firmness, specific sounds or silence, darkness at a particular level. You've conditioned yourself to need specific parameters for sleep. Mountain men condition themselves to sleep regardless of parameters. On frozen ground, half covered by snow, with wind howling and the fire dying and pain in their feet from mild frostbite. They slept anyway, because they learned that sleep was more important than comfort. that you could feel terrible and still rest. This is psychological training that's almost impossible to replicate artificially. You can't decide one day to sleep through discomfort. Your nervous system won't allow it. It takes months or years of gradual conditioning. And once you have it, you never lose it. There are accounts of old mountain men in their 60s and 70s, long retired to settlements, who still slept differently than other people, less affected by temperature, able to doze anywhere. The training had become permanent. There's an interesting debate among historians about whether this psychological hardening came at a cost. Some argue that mountain men developed a kind of emotional blunting, that the same mental processes that let them ignore cold also made them less sensitive to other forms of suffering, their own and others. The journals support this to some degree. There's a casualness about describing injuries and deaths that seems almost sociopathic by modern standards. But it might just be acceptance again. Death in the mountains was common. Fearing it constantly would be exhausting. So they acknowledged it and moved on. Modern culture tells us to be vigilant about danger, to respond to every warning signal our body sends, to treat discomfort as information that something is wrong. That's useful in environments where discomfort usually indicates a solvable problem. Too cold? Adjust the thermostat. Too hungry? Eat something. Too tired? Sleep. Mountain men lived in an environment where discomfort often had no immediate solution. You were cold because it was winter in the Rockies. No thermostat to adjust. You were hungry because game was scarce. No grocery store. You were tired because you'd been hauling traps through waist-deep snow. No option but to keep going. Responding to those signals with anxiety or fear didn't help. So they learned not to. They developed what might be called productive stoicism. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to feel cold, hunger, pain, exhaustion, and then set those feelings aside to focus on what needed doing. This is a mental skill that modern comfort has made nearly extinct. We're encouraged to honor our feelings, to listen to our bodies, to prioritize self-care and acknowledge our limits, all of which is probably healthy in modern contexts. But it's training that would get you killed in 1830 Wyoming. There's also the communal aspect. Mountain men didn't suffer alone. Everyone in camp was cold. Everyone was uncomfortable, but complaining was pointless. So there developed a culture of dark humor and understatement. A blizzard that killed horses became a bit breezy. Frostbite that cost a man 2 toes was a mite chilly last night. This wasn't toxic masculinity suppressing legitimate distress. It was a survival strategy. Humor diffuses fear. Understatement prevents panic from spreading. If everyone acknowledged how terrible conditions actually were, the psychological weight would be crushing. So they made it normal. Boring even. Just another cold night. Nothing special. And that collective psychological fortress kept everyone functional. Let yourself sink deeper now into your warm bed. Feel how your mind doesn't have to fight anything. No cold to accept. No discomfort to endure. No psychological fortress to maintain. Just comfort. Simple, uncomplicated comfort. The kind that would have seemed miraculous to men who spent months training their minds to survive without it. You don't need their strength. You never will. And that's okay. Let that truth be as comfortable as your blanket, as warm as your room, as easy as your breath. Weather prediction used to be a survival skill, not a convenience, not something you checked on your phone before planning your day. A literal life or death necessity. Mountain men could read the sky the way you read text messages. Instinctively, constantly, with an accuracy that would seem supernatural if it wasn't just forgotten knowledge. Let's start with the obvious signs. Cloud types and movement. You probably know that dark clouds mean rain. But do you know the difference between nimbostratus and cumulonimbus? Mountain men didn't know those Latin terms, but they knew which cloud formations meant snow in 3 hours versus snow in 30 minutes. High, wispy clouds, what we call cirrus, meant weather change coming in 12 to 24 hours, usually a storm system moving in. If those clouds thickened and lowered through the day, you had maybe 6 hours before serious weather hit. Time to gather extra firewood and secure camp. Mammotus clouds, those poachy, bumpy formations that look like the sky has tumors, meant severe weather was already here or minutes away. You didn't need to see those twice to remember them. But it went deeper than clouds. The color of the sky told stories. Red sky at morning, sailor's warning. You've heard that one. It's actually true. Red morning sky means moisture-laden air to the west catching sunrise. Weather systems in North America generally move west to east. So moisture to the west means it's heading your way. Red sky at night meant the western sky was clear. The storm had passed or wasn't coming. Mountain men also watched the moon. A ring around the moon, caused by ice crystals in high cirrus clouds, meant precipitation within 24 hours. The size of the ring correlated roughly with how soon it would arrive. Big ring, distant storm. Small tight ring, imminent weather. This isn't superstition. It's atmospheric optics combined with meteorological patterns. But you have to spend years watching to calibrate the relationship. And there were the stars. Not for navigation, though that too, but for humidity. Stars twinkle more when the atmosphere is turbulent and moist. On a crystalline clear night with barely any twinkling, you could bet on continued fair weather. If stars were twinkling heavily, even on a clear night, moisture was building. Storm likely within a day. Temperature gradients told their own story. If the day was warm but temperature dropped sharply at sunset, you were in for a calm, cold night. If temperature stayed relatively stable after sunset, warm air was moving in above the cold surface air. That's an inversion layer. Usually meant a warm front approaching, which often brought snow. Mountain men tracked these patterns without ever hearing the word meteorology. Wind direction mattered enormously. In the Rockies, west winds brought moisture from the Pacific. East winds were generally dry. North winds brought bitter cold from Canada. South winds suggested warm air pushing up, which could mean either nice weather or violent storms depending on other factors. But it wasn't just wind direction. It was how the wind shifted through the day. A wind that veered, turned clockwise through the day, say from north to east to south, suggested a high-pressure system and stable weather. Wind that backed, turned counterclockwise, suggested low pressure and deteriorating conditions. There's a journal entry from Jim Bridger where he describes smelling snow. Historians initially dismissed this as frontier mysticism, but it's real. Snow has a smell, or rather, the atmospheric conditions that produce snow have a smell. A kind of metallic, clean scent from high humidity and specific temperature profiles. After enough winters, you could literally smell when snow was 6 or 8 hours away. Then there were animal behaviors. Not old wives' tales. Actual observable patterns. Birds flying lower than usual meant low air pressure. Storms coming. Birds congregating and feeding frantically meant they sensed a storm and were loading up on calories before it hit. Deer and elk moving down from high country suggested heavy snow coming to the mountains. They could sense pressure changes and temperature drops better than any barometer. Horses and mules got nervous before storms. Restless, unwilling to settle. Mountain men paid attention to their animals' behavior as much as the sky. Insects, too. Mosquitoes and flies more aggressive than usual meant low pressure. Spiders building webs across trails suggested continued fair weather. They wouldn't waste energy on construction if storm was imminent. Some historians argue these animal-based predictions are confirmation bias, that people only remembered the times animals were right and forgot the times they were wrong. There's probably some truth to that. But when your life depends on prediction, you learn which signs are reliable and which aren't. Mountain men ran natural experiments every week for years. The patterns that survived weren't superstition. They were data. There was also the simple matter of attention. Modern people check weather apps multiple times a day, but never actually look at the sky. Mountain men check the sky multiple times an hour. Morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, dawn. Watching how patterns evolve through 24-hour cycles. You can't learn sky reading from a book or a weekend workshop. It takes seasons, years, thousands of observations building into intuition, until you glance up and just know that tonight will be colder than last night, that tomorrow will bring snow by noon, that the day after will clear. Not from reasoning through cloud types and wind direction, just from seeing patterns repeated so many times they become instinct. We've traded all of this for Doppler radar and computer models, which are better objectively, more accurate, more specific. A weather app can tell you it'll start snowing at 2:47 p.m. Mountain men could only say this afternoon, but they didn't need to carry anything. Didn't need batteries or satellites or cell service. Just eyes and attention and years of learning to read what was written across the sky every single day. There's something almost sad about this loss. Not practically sad. We're clearly better off with modern forecasting, but existentially sad. We've closed off a channel of communication with the natural world. We no longer speak weather as a language. We just read translations provided by machines. Mountain men had conversations with the sky. They asked questions with their observations and received answers in wind shifts and cloud movements. That dialogue is gone, replaced by push notifications and hourly forecasts. More useful, less intimate. Let your eyes closed now. You don't need to read the sky tonight. Don't need to smell the snow or watch how the fire smoke rises. Your room will stay exactly as it is until morning. 70 degrees. Calm. Predictable. The weather is someone else's problem. Some satellite's concern, not yours. Let that freedom from vigilance wrap around you as you drift deeper, knowing that tomorrow's weather will arrive whether you predict it or not. And you'll be fine either way. Nobody survived alone. That's the myth we need to address first. Hollywood loves the solitary mountain man, the lone wolf figure who needs no one. Rugged individualism personified. It's almost entirely fiction. Real mountain men traveled in pairs at minimum, often in larger groups, because winter in the mountains wasn't a place for independence. It was a place where isolation meant death. Let's talk about the practical reasons first. Then we'll get to the stranger ones. Two men can maintain a fire through the night in shifts. One sleeps while the other tends the flames. Then they switch. Neither has to wake up frozen because the fire died. One man alone has to choose between sleep and warmth. Usually he gets neither properly. Two men can hunt more effectively. One drives game toward the other. Or they split up to cover more territory while staying close enough to signal if there's trouble. One man alone covers half the territory in twice the time. Two men can haul twice the gear and supplies. Share the weight of traps, ammunition, food, blankets. One man alone is limited by what he can carry on his back and his horse. Two men can defend each other against bears, hostile encounters, accidents. If one falls through ice or gets injured, the other can help. One man alone with a broken leg simply dies. These are the obvious advantages, the practical calculus that made partnership necessary. But there was something deeper, something we've almost completely lost in modern culture. Shared body heat, not as an emergency measure, as a normal, regular practice. On the coldest nights, we're talking 30, 40 below, mountain men slept together, under the same buffalo robe, back to back or front to back, fully clothed, obviously, but pressed together, sharing warmth. This saved lives. Two bodies generate more heat than one. But more importantly, two bodies lose heat more slowly than one. Surface area to volume ratio, a principle of physics. Two people huddled together have less surface area exposed to cold air relative to their combined mass than two people sleeping separately. It's significant, maybe the difference between maintaining core temperature and hypothermia. But it required intimacy that modern Western culture finds deeply uncomfortable. These weren't romantic partners. They were business associates, often men who'd met months earlier, sometimes men who didn't particularly like each other. But survival trumped social awkwardness. You swallowed your discomfort about physical closeness because the alternative was freezing. There's a fascinating anthropological debate about how much this practice contributed to the mountain man culture. Some scholars argue it created unusually strong bonds, that men who literally kept each other alive through shared warmth developed loyalty that transcended normal friendship. Others suggest it was purely transactional, no different than sharing a tent. The truth probably varied by pair, but the practice was universal. Trappers who insisted on sleeping alone didn't last long. Either they learned to partner up or they didn't survive their first winter. It wasn't about toughness. It was about physics and biology. Horses played a similar role. On truly desperate nights, men would sleep pressed against their horses. The animal's body heat made the difference. Some mountain men describe digging pits in snow, leading their horse into it, and sleeping against the horse's belly with a robe draped over both of them. The horse provided hundreds of pounds of warmth. The pit blocked wind. The robe insulated both man and animal. It sounds absurd until you remember that horses are walking furnaces. 1,000-pound animal generating enormous heat just through normal metabolism. Letting that heat radiate into the air is wasteful. Using it to survive makes perfect sense. The horses, for their part, seemed to tolerate this arrangement. Maybe they appreciated the windbreak and extra insulation too. Maybe they've been trained to it. Or maybe they simply accepted it as part of the strange partnership with humans. This whole system required trust. Real, profound trust. You're trusting your partner not to steal your gear while you sleep, not to abandon you if things get difficult, not to panic and make stupid decisions that get you both killed. You're trusting that when it's his turn to tend the fire, he'll actually stay awake. That when he says he saw signs of a storm, he's being honest. That when he takes the lead-breaking trail through snow, he's choosing the safest route. Mountain men developed reputations. Men who were reliable partners got invited back season after season. Men who were unreliable or selfish found themselves alone. And alone in the mountains meant a short career. There are journals describing the process of choosing a partner. It's taken seriously. Almost like a marriage, some historians note. You're committing to spend months in close quarters under terrible conditions with this person. You need compatible personalities, similar risk tolerance, complementary skills. If you're good at tracking but bad at fire starting, you want a partner who's the opposite. If you're prone to rash decisions, you want someone cautious. If you're too cautious, you want someone willing to take calculated risks. The best partnerships were balanced, each man covering the other's weaknesses. Some partnerships lasted years, decades even. There are records of men who trapped together for 15, 20 winters, who knew each other's habits so well they could communicate with gestures, who could look at tracks and know what the other was thinking. That kind of partnership went beyond practical necessity. It became its own form of intimacy, not romantic, not even necessarily friendship in the modern sense, but a deep, functional understanding, a bond forged in shared survival. Modern culture has lost this completely. We prize independence above almost everything. The ability to take care of yourself. Need no one. Rely on no one. We've built systems, economic, social, architectural, that make this possible. You can live alone in a house. Work a job where you barely interact with colleagues. Order everything online. Never depend on another human for survival. It's unprecedented in human history, and it comes with costs we're only beginning to measure. Loneliness, alienation, the sense that you're completely alone even in crowds. Mountain men were never alone in that existential way, even if they didn't like their partner, even if they argued and got frustrated with each other. They were bound together by necessity, and maybe that binding, that forced interdependence provided something we've lost. A certainty that you matter to at least one other person, not because they like you, but because you keep each other alive. There's something primal about that, something that touches evolutionary programming deep in human psychology. We're not evolved for independence. We're evolved for tribes and partnerships and mutual dependence. Mountain men, for all their reputation as loners, actually live closer to that evolutionary template than we do. They couldn't afford the luxury of isolation, so they slept back to back, shared robes and horses and fire duty, trusted each other because trust wasn't optional, and survived things that would kill any of us attempting them alone. Feel the space around you now, your personal space, your individual bed, no one pressed against your back, no need to coordinate with anyone, just you, alone, comfortable, safe. It's a privilege beyond anything mountain men could imagine. The privilege of not needing anyone, at least not physically, not immediately, not to survive the night. Let that independence wrap around you like another blanket. Warm, isolating, peaceful, as you drift deeper into sleep. Alone, perfectly alone. Let's talk about the things that don't work. The myths Hollywood sold us. The comforting lies about how men stayed warm. Because mountain men definitely use tobacco and whiskey, just not the way you think, and not for the reasons you've been told. Start with alcohol. Every frontier movie shows men passing a whiskey bottle around a campfire, taking long pulls to warm up, feeling that burn spread through their chest, laughing as the cold recedes. It's a beautiful scene. It's also physiologically backward. Alcohol doesn't warm you. It makes you colder. This is an opinion. It's biology. When you drink alcohol, blood vessels near your skin dilate. That's why you feel warm. Your face flushes. Your skin tingles. Heat spreads from your core to your extremities. Feels wonderful. But that heat you're feeling? It's your core temperature escaping, radiating out through your skin into the cold air. You're literally bleeding warmth into the environment. And you feel good doing it because your skin's temperature sensors are registering warmth. But your core, where it matters, is getting colder. People who drink heavily and pass out in cold environments die of hypothermia faster than sober people in the same conditions. This is documented, proven, undeniable. So why did mountain men drink whiskey? They did, constantly, according to journals and trading post records. But not for warmth, for pain management, for boredom, for the psychological escape from months of brutal conditions. And, this is important, they drank strategically, usually after they'd made camp and built fire and done all the hard work of survival. Whiskey was a reward, not a tool. You didn't drink before hauling traps through snow. You drank after, when you were as safe as you were going to get. When the fire was built solid and you were wrapped in your robe and the immediate danger had passed. Then you could afford to let your guard down. Let the whiskey do its work of making everything hurt a little less. But there's a wrinkle here. Some mountain men claimed whiskey helped prevent frostbite. Not by warming you, they weren't stupid, but by improving circulation during the warming process. The theory was that after being dangerously cold, a small amount of alcohol could help blood return to extremities as you warmed by the fire. Historians debate whether this actually worked or was just rationalization for drinking. Modern medical research suggests it might have a tiny kernel of truth in specific circumstances, during controlled rewarming, but probably not enough to matter. Mostly it was just an excuse. Men wanted to drink. The frontier was brutal and boring and terrifying. Whiskey helped, so they developed folk theories about why it was medicinal. Sound familiar? We do the same thing now with wine and chocolate and whatever else we want to justify. Tobacco is its own interesting story. Mountain men smoked pipes constantly, chewed tobacco, carried it as a valuable trade good with Native Americans. But warming properties? None. Nicotine is a vasoconstrictor. It narrows blood vessels, reduces circulation to extremities. If anything, tobacco makes you more susceptible to frostbite. Yet mountain men believed it helped. Some journals describe tobacco as essential for cold weather survival. Why the disconnect? Probably because nicotine has mild stimulant properties. It makes you feel more alert, more focused. In conditions where mental fatigue could kill you, that mattered. Tobacco kept you sharp when cold was making you sluggish, helped you stay awake on fire watch, gave you something to do with your hands and mouth during long, boring hours of just surviving. The ritual of packing a pipe, lighting it with a coal from the fire, smoking slowly, it provided structure to empty time. Psychological comfort masquerading as physical warmth. There's also the social component. Sharing tobacco was a bonding ritual between partners, with Native Americans during trading. Around campfires, it created moments of peace and community in an otherwise harsh existence. That psychological warmth, the comfort of ritual and connection, might have felt like physical warmth to men whose lives had very little comfort. So they convinced themselves tobacco helped with cold, because in a way it did, just not through any mechanism that would show up in a medical study. Then there are the weirder remedies. Bear grease rubbed on skin to prevent frostbite. This one actually has some merit. Not magical properties, just basic physics. A layer of grease provides minor insulation and windproofing, helps prevent moisture loss from skin. Mountain men would coat their faces in bare grease before going out in bitter wind. It worked. A little. Not dramatically, but every little bit helped. Some trappers believed that eating raw liver before sleep would keep them warmer through the night. The logic was that raw meat was heating while cooked meat was cooling. This is complete nonsense physiologically, though liver is extremely nutrient-dense and high in calories. So eating liver probably did help fuel body heat, just not because it was raw. Despite that, the belief persisted. Men would choke down raw liver and swear it made a difference. Confirmation bias is powerful. If you believe something helps and you survive the night, that's proof it worked. Never mind that you would have survived anyway. There were prayers too, rituals, lucky objects, specific ways of arranging your bedroll that supposedly trapped more warmth. Some of these had practical basis. Many didn't. But mountain men couldn't always tell the difference. And in an environment where control was mostly illusion, any sense of control mattered. Modern survival experts often laugh at historical remedies, point out the bad science, the superstition, but there's something almost admirable about it too. These men were doing their best with the knowledge they had, running experiments on themselves, trying anything that might help. Some of it worked. Some of it was placebo. Some of it was actively counterproductive, but felt good enough that they kept doing it. We're not that different now. We take supplements with dubious science behind them, believe in detoxes that don't actually detox anything, convince ourselves that certain foods or drinks have properties they don't possess. The human need to believe we have some control over our well-being hasn't changed, just the specific myths we tell ourselves. Mountain men had whiskey for warmth. We have alkaline water for health. Different era. Same psychology. The real lesson isn't that mountain men were wrong about alcohol and tobacco. It's that humans are remarkably good at surviving despite our misconceptions. Mountain men lived through conditions that should have killed them. They did it with half-understood biology and folk remedies that mostly didn't work. But they also did it with real knowledge about fire and shelter and fat consumption. The combination was enough. Barely, but enough. Let yourself feel that now. The comfort of not needing remedies. Not needing to rub bare grease on your face, or choke down raw liver, or drink whiskey for warmth. Your comfort isn't folk wisdom or lucky rituals. It's just engineering, thermostats, and insulation and electrical grids. Boring, reliable, perfectly effective. As you sink deeper, no myths required. Let's talk about damage. The kind that modern emergency rooms exist to prevent, but mountain men just lived with. Frostbite wasn't an emergency. It was Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, an expected consequence of doing business in winter, and the way they dealt with it would horrify modern medical professionals. But it kept them alive, mostly. First, understand that frostbite comes in degrees, literally degrees of tissue damage. First degree is superficial. Your skin gets white and numb. Feels like plastic. You warm it slowly and it recovers completely. No permanent damage if you're careful. Mountain men got first-degree frostbite probably weekly, maybe daily during the worst cold. Fingers, toes, nose, ears, cheeks. All the extremities where circulation retreats to protect your core. They notice the numbness, though after a while, you stop noticing because numbness becomes normal. Then they'd warm the affected area, usually by the fire, sometimes against their own body or their partner's body. Never quickly. This is where folk wisdom actually aligned with medical science. Rapid rewarming of frozen tissue causes more damage than the initial freezing. Ice crystals form inside cells during freezing. Rapid thaw makes those crystals expand and rupture cell membranes. Slow thaw lets them melt gradually with less cellular destruction. Mountain men learned this through trial and error. Men who thawed frostbitten hands directly over flames lost fingers. Men who thawed slowly in their armpits kept their fingers. Word spread. Techniques improved. They didn't understand the cellular biology, but they understood cause and effect. Second-degree frostbite is where things get serious. This is when ice crystals form deeper in tissue. When you rewarm, blisters develop. clear blisters if you're lucky. Blood-filled blisters if you're not. The pain is extraordinary, like your flesh is on fire from the inside, because damaged nerve endings are misfiring, sending every signal at once. Mountain men dealt with this regularly too. They'd lance the blisters carefully with a clean knife heated in fire, drain the fluid, wrap the area in whatever clean cloth they had, usually not very clean by modern standards. Then they just keep going, because stopping wasn't an option. Infection was a real risk. Pre-antibiotics, any open wound could turn septic. Some men lost fingers or toes to infection after frostbite that should have been survivable. Others got lucky. Their bodies fought off the bacteria. The wounds healed. Scarred and sensitive, but healed. It was a dice roll. You did your best and hoped. Third-degree frostbite is catastrophic. Tissue death. Black, mummified flesh. Usually means amputation or permanent loss of function. Mountain men saw this too. Not as often, because third degree usually meant you'd made serious mistakes. Fallen through ice and couldn't get dry. Passed out drunk in a storm. Got caught away from camp during a sudden temperature drop. But it happened. There are journals describing men with blackened toes, walking on destroyed feet because they had no choice. The dead tissue would eventually separate on its own. The body mummifies and rejects what it can't save. A toe would literally fall off after weeks or months. Self-amputation through natural processes. It's horrifying, but also remarkable. The body's ability to isolate and discard damaged tissue kept many men alive. Their immune systems doing crude surgery that saved them from systemic infection. Modern medicine can do better, obviously. We have antibiotics and surgical techniques and hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We can save tissue that would have been lost 200 years ago. But mountain men didn't have any of that, so they relied on their body's natural healing. And surprisingly often, it worked. There's a letter from Joe Meek, a famous mountain man, describing his toes. He'd lost parts of 3 toes to frostbite over various winters. He described it casually, matter-of-factly, like mentioning he'd gotten a haircut. The psychological adaptation to accepting permanent injury as routine is stunning. Most modern people will be traumatized by losing even part of one toe. Mountain men lost multiple body parts and just adjusted, learned to walk differently, wore different moccasins, kept trapping. Pain tolerance was part of it, but not just tolerance. Acceptance, the understanding that your body would accumulate damage, that this was the cost of the life you'd chosen. You could quit and go back to civilization, or you could pay the price in frozen flesh. Most kept paying. Some frontier medicine was surprisingly sophisticated. They'd pack frostbite wounds with moss or cattail down as bandaging. Both have mild antimicrobial properties, though they didn't know that. They just knew these materials seemed to help wounds heal cleaner. They'd make poultices from pine sap mixed with animal fat. The sap has actual antibacterial compounds. The fat keeps the bandage from sticking to damaged tissue. Again, they didn't know the chemistry, just that it worked better than nothing. Sometimes they cauterize wounds with hot metal. This seems barbaric, and it was, but also sealed blood vessels and killed surface bacteria. In the absence of better options, it sometimes saved lives, or at least saved limbs. There's an archaeological study of skeletal remains from fur trade era that found high rates of healed fractures and bone deformities consistent with poorly set breaks. These men were breaking bones and just splinting them as best they could. Often the bones healed crooked. Sometimes they didn't heal at all, just formed painful false joints. But the men survived and kept working. Modern orthopedics could fix these injuries completely. Surgical pins and plates. Perfect alignment. Physical therapy. Mountain men just tied sticks to broken legs and hoped. The infection rate from any significant injury was probably terrifying. We don't have good statistics because many men simply disappeared, went out to check trap lines, and never came back. Some died of cold or predators, but many probably died of infected wounds. Frostbite turning septic, a cut that got dirty and poisoned their blood, their bodies failing in ways that antibiotics could have prevented. Those men don't show up in journals, don't get remembered, just vanish into the mountains. But the ones who survived through luck or strong immune systems or sheer stubbornness, they lived with the consequences. Scarred hands that didn't close all the way. Feet with missing toes that made walking on ice treacherous. Faces marked by frostbite scars. These were badges in frontier culture. Proof you'd endured. Evidence of winters survived. Modern culture hides damage. We have plastic surgery and scar reduction treatments. We pursue perfect bodies preserved against age and injury. Mountain men wore their damage openly. Couldn't hide it if they tried. And maybe didn't want to. Your body right now is probably intact. All fingers and toes present and accounted for. Skin unbroken and healthy. No frozen tissue slowly dying. No wounds wrapped in moss and hope. Just wholeness. Comfortable, protected wholeness. Let that gratitude sink in as you drift deeper, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake, and all your pieces will still be attached, still working, still yours. No price paid in flesh. No permanent damage. Just sleep. Easy, healing sleep. Money makes people do insane things. Always has. Always will. And in the 1820s through 1840s, beaver pelts were money. Serious money. The kind of money that made freezing nights seem like a reasonable business expense. Let's put this in perspective. A prime beaver pelt, thick winter fur, properly stretched and dried, could fetch $5 to $8 at a trading post. That doesn't sound like much until you adjust for inflation and context. $5 in 1830 equals roughly $150 today. A skilled labor back east might make $1 a day. So one beaver pelt represented a week's wages for a factory worker or farmhand. A good trapper could take 30 to 60 pelts in a winter season. Sometimes more if he was skilled and lucky. Do the math. That's $150 to $300 for a winter's work. 5 to 10 times what a laborer made in the same period. Suddenly those frozen nights look like a calculated investment. Risk versus reward. Suffer through brutal conditions for a few months and potentially earn more than most men made in a year. For young men with few prospects, that math was compelling. That's why they came. Not for adventure, though the adventure drew some. Not to escape civilization, though some did that too. But primarily for money. The frontier wasn't romantic to them. It was a job. A dangerous, uncomfortable, occasionally fatal job that paid well when it paid at all. The economics created a boom and bust cycle. When beaver was in high demand, driven by European hat fashion that required beaver felt, prices soared. More men flooded into the mountains. More pelts flooded the market. Prices dropped. Marginal trappers couldn't make enough to justify the suffering. They quit or died. Supply decreased. Prices rose again. Mountain men were living inside a brutal market mechanism. Their bodies and lives were the production capital. Their suffering was overhead. And like any commodity market, it was ruthless. The trading posts, called forts, though they were really just commercial outposts, controlled the economics in ways that would make modern corporations jealous. They had monopolies on supplies. If you needed gunpowder or traps or flour or whiskey, you bought from them. At whatever price they set, they'd extend credit to trappers in the fall, outfit them with gear and supplies, then collect payment in pelts come spring. The interest rates were extortionate. A trap that cost $2 in St. Louis might be sold for $6 at the fort, marked up 300%, because where else were you going to buy one? Many trappers ended each season owing more than their pelts were worth, caught in a debt cycle that required them to trap another season just to break even. This wasn't accidental. It was business model. Keep the trappers dependent. Keep them producing. Extract maximum value from their labor while minimizing what you pay them. Some men figured this out and tried to work independently, trade directly with Native Americans, or sell to competing posts. But the logistics were nearly impossible. You couldn't haul a season's worth of pelts across hundreds of miles alone. You needed the infrastructure the big companies provided. So most stayed trapped in the system, literally and economically. There were legendary rendezvous, annual gatherings where trappers sold pelts and bought supplies. These lasted a few weeks each summer and were wild affairs. Men who'd been isolated for months, drinking and gambling and spending money recklessly. The trading companies loved rendezvous because the same men who just sold their pelts would immediately spend that money on marked-up whiskey and goods. A trapper might make $300 from his winter's work, spend $250 at rendezvous, head back into the mountains with $50 in renewed debt. It was economically rational for the companies and economically disastrous for individual trappers. But after months of isolation and suffering, the psychological need for release was overwhelming. Men made terrible financial decisions because they were starved for society and pleasure. The companies knew this and exploited it systematically. Some historians argue the mountain man era was really just corporate exploitation dressed in buckskin, that the romantic image obscures what was essentially wage slavery under horrific conditions. There's truth to that, but it also ignores the agency many trappers had. They chose this life, often repeatedly. Even men who made it out would return for another season, because despite the exploitation and suffering, it offered something rare. Freedom from industrial discipline. Work on your own schedule. Lie by your own rules. Take risks that could pay off dramatically or kill you, but at least they were risks. For men trapped in eastern factories or farms they'd never own, that freedom was worth the cold, worth the isolation, worth the very real possibility of death. The economics also created strange status hierarchies. A man with 60 pelts had earned perhaps $500 that winter. He was successful, respected. A man with 20 pelts had barely broken even after supplies. He was marginal, questioned. Your worth as a human being was literally counted in dead beaver. This seems crude now, but our economy works the same way, just with different markers. We measure worth in salary and net worth and job titles instead of pelts. But the underlying principle that economic productivity determines social value hasn't changed at all. Mountain men were just more honest about it. The beaver population collapsed by the 1840s, overharvested to near extinction in many regions. The market moved on. Silk hats replaced beaver felt in fashion. Suddenly, those pelts were worth a fraction of what they'd been. The entire economic structure evaporated almost overnight. Men who'd spent decades perfecting their craft found their skills worthless. The suffering they'd endured, the damage their bodies had accumulated, the winters that had taken fingers and toes, all of it suddenly for nothing. No pension, no retirement fund, just scarred bodies and obsolete knowledge. Some adapted, became guides or scouts, or settled into farming. Others never recovered economically or psychologically. There's a melancholy to late journals from the 1840s and 50s. Men realizing their suffering had been temporary market conditions, that they traded pieces of themselves for money that evaporated when fashion changed. It raises uncomfortable questions. How much suffering is justified by economic reward? How do you calculate whether frozen nights and lost fingers were worth the money, especially when that money turns out to be temporary and the damage permanent? These aren't historical questions. We face them constantly. How many hours should you work? How much of your health should you trade for salary? How much of your life should you sacrifice for retirement accounts? Mountain men had a starker version of the calculation, but it's fundamentally the same question, and we're no better at answering it than they were. Let yourself feel the comfort of not having to make that trade. Your warmth isn't connected to productivity. You don't have to freeze to earn your shelter. Don't have to count the value of your suffering in pelts or dollars. You just get to be warm, because you live in a time and place where warmth isn't earned through cold. It's just available, a gift of infrastructure and energy systems, not personal merit or economic productivity. Just luck, historical luck, geographical luck. Let that unearned comfort surround you now, as you sink deeper still, knowing that tomorrow's warmth is guaranteed, not by your suffering, but by systems built by millions of people you'll never meet. That's privilege, real privilege. And tonight, you get to simply enjoy it. History lies by omission. The story you've heard so far is incomplete, because mountain men didn't survive alone, and they didn't survive just with other men. Women were there. Indigenous women primarily. Shoshone, Crow, Flathead, Nez Perce. Their knowledge made survival possible. but their names barely appear in the historical record. Let's correct that as much as we can. When a mountain man took a Native American wife, and many did, he wasn't just acquiring companionship. He was gaining access to survival knowledge accumulated over generations. These women knew things no white man had learned. Which roots stayed edible through winter. How to process hides so they stayed supple in freezing temperatures. Where to find cattail down for insulation. How to predict weather from signs white trappers missed entirely. The proper way to smoke meat so it lasted months without spoiling. Which pine bark was edible in emergencies. How to make thread from animal sinew. How to waterproof leather with specific combinations of brain matter and oils. This wasn't primitive folk knowledge. It was sophisticated environmental science, passed mother to daughter for millennia, and it kept white trappers alive. There's a journal entry from Warren Angus Ferris describing his Nez Perce wife repairing his moccasins. He focuses on her skill with a needle, but what he's really describing is her understanding of how footwear fails in cold conditions. She's reinforcing stress points he didn't know existed, using stitching patterns that distribute pressure differently, adding insulation layers in locations that matter most. He saw it as domestic work. She was performing engineering. The same applies to food preparation. White trappers without native wives often suffered from malnutrition despite having plenty of meat, because they didn't know how to process and combine foods for complete nutrition. Indigenous women understood, without formal education in vitamins or minerals, that you needed variety. Meat plus specific roots, plus berries, plus bone, marrow, plus organ meats, combined in ways that provided everything a body needed. They'd prepare pemmican with ratios perfected over generations. Not random mixtures, but precise combinations. Too much fat, and it wouldn't keep. Too little, and it didn't provide enough energy. They knew the balance instinctively. Mountain men who married indigenous women survived winters better, had fewer nutritional deficiencies, recovered faster from injuries. This is documented in trading post records. Men with native wives traded for fewer medicinal supplies, requested less assistance during hard winters. The wives were the difference. But history credits the men's toughness. These marriages were complex. Some were genuinely loving partnerships. Others were transactional, protection and goods exchanged for labor and knowledge. Many fell somewhere in between. It's important not to romanticize them. Indigenous women often had limited choice in these arrangements. Their communities sometimes encouraged marriages with white trappers for political or economic reasons. The power dynamics were rarely equal, but it's also important not to reduce these women to victims. Many exercised considerable agency within their circumstances, chose specific partners, negotiated terms, left men who mistreated them, built lives that balanced their cultural identity with frontier reality. Some became wealthy and influential in their own right. There are records of indigenous women who managed trading operations, who controlled access to prime beaver streams, who brokered peace between hostile groups. Their names survive when they were exceptional enough that white men couldn't ignore them. Sacagawea is famous because Lewis and Clark wrote about her, but there were dozens, probably hundreds, of women providing similar guidance to mountain men. They just didn't have journals written about them. Indigenous women also understood cold weather survival in ways that went beyond practical skills. They knew how to maintain psychological resilience during endless winters, had cultural practices around managing isolation and hardship, songs and stories that provided structure and meaning to suffering. White trappers who integrated into their wives' cultural frameworks survived better psychologically, had lower rates of what we now recognize as seasonal depression, maintained better morale during the worst months. The women were providing mental health support that frontier culture had no language to describe. So it went unrecorded, unrecognized, but absolutely essential. There were also white women in the mountains. Far fewer, but they existed. Missionaries' wives primarily. Women who came west with their husbands to civilize the frontier. They suffered immensely because they tried to maintain Eastern domestic standards in environments that made those standards lethal. refusing to adopt indigenous clothing and food preparation, insisting on proper homes rather than practical shelters. Their journals describe constant misery and frequent death. Childbirth in winter camps without medical care killed many. Disease killed more. The sheer psychological weight of trying to impose unsuitable culture on an unforgiving environment broke others. Those who survived learned to adopt indigenous practices, started wearing buckskin instead of long dresses, learned to tan hides and process food efficiently, essentially became more like the native women they'd come to help. But they rarely acknowledged this publicly. Their letters home maintained the fiction that they were bringing civilization to wilderness, while privately adopting the wilderness's superior survival strategies. There's a fascinating historical debate about gender and frontier survival. Some scholars argue women were inherently disadvantaged, physically weaker, burdened by pregnancy and childcare, more vulnerable. Others argue women had advantages, better at maintaining social bonds that provided safety nets, more adaptable to changing circumstances, more willing to learn from indigenous people. The truth is probably that survival depended on individuals, not gender. Capable people survived. Rigid people died. Whether they were male or female mattered less than their ability to adapt. But the historical record is so skewed toward male experiences that we'll never have a complete picture. What's certain is that the mountain man story as traditionally told, lone men conquering wilderness through masculine toughness, is fiction. The reality was interdependence. Men and women, white and native, different knowledge systems combining. Survival was collaborative, not individual. But collaboration doesn't fit the heroic narrative. So women get edited out, reduced to footnotes or romantic interests. Their essential contributions made invisible. This pattern repeats throughout history. In every frontier, every expedition, every survival story. Men get the credit. Women get forgotten, unless we deliberately look for them. Listen for the names that barely appear. Ask who made the moccasins, who prepared the food, who knew when the weather would turn, who kept men alive through winters they couldn't have survived alone. The answer is always there, just written too small for most history books to notice. Feel your own comfort now, built on labor you'll never see, maintained by people whose names you don't know. That's true of mountain men and true of you. Comfort is always collaborative, always depends on others, whether they're acknowledged or not. Let that thought drift through your mind as you sink deeper into rest, built on foundations you'll never fully understand, but can still be grateful for. Let's talk about objects, the specific things that separated life from death. Because survival wasn't abstract, it was concrete, material, dependent on having exactly the right equipment and knowing exactly how to use it. Start with the possibles bag. Every mountain man carried one, a leather pouch slung across the body, usually made from brain-tanned deer or elk hide. Inside was everything you absolutely needed if you got separated from your camp or horse. Flint and steel, obviously. Char cloth wrapped in something waterproof, usually a scrap of oiled leather or animal bladder. A handful of lead balls for your rifle. Powder in a smaller waterproof container. A knife whetstone, sinew thread, and a bone needle. Sometimes a fishhook carved from bone. A few strips of jerky if you had it. This bag lived against your body. Always. You slept with it. Never set it down. Because losing your possibles bag meant losing the ability to make fire, hunt, or repair gear. It was essentially your survival distributed across 10 pounds of carefully curated items. The contents varied by individual, but certain items were universal. The knife is worth special attention. Not just any knife, a specific style. Most mountain men carried what we'd now call a butcher knife. 8 to 10 inches of blade. Fixed handle, no folding mechanism that could break. Carbon steel that held an edge, but was soft enough to sharpen on river stones. This knife did everything. Skinning animals, processing meat, cutting leather, prying frozen knots loose, splitting kindling, defense if absolutely necessary. A good knife could last decades with proper care. Mountain men treated their knives like sacred objects, sharpened them obsessively, oiled the metal to prevent rust, replaced handles multiple times as wood wore out. They're museum pieces, knives used for 30 years or more. Blades worn thin from endless sharpening, but still functional. Handles dark and smooth from palm oil and use. These weren't tools you replaced when they got old. They were tools you maintained until they wore away to nothing. Moccasins deserve their own discussion. Factory-made boots didn't work in the mountains. The leather was too stiff. The construction too rigid. They'd crack and fail in extreme cold. So mountain men wore moccasins. But not simple moccasins. Highly engineered ones. The basic pattern was Native American. Soft leather wrapped around the foot and sewn up the front. But mountain men adapted them. Double-soled for durability. The inner sole with hair turned in for insulation. The outer sole of thicker leather, often smoked to make it more waterproof. In deep winter, they'd stuff the space between soles with dried grass or cattail down, creating an air gap that insulated better than solid leather. The uppers extended well above the ankle, tied with leather thongs that could be adjusted as your feet swelled or contracted with temperature. A good pair of winter moccasins took days to make. Had to be custom fitted to your feet because everyone's feet are different, and you needed multiple pairs because they wore out fast. A season of hard trapping could destroy 3 or 4 pairs. Women, usually native wives, made most moccasins. Their stitching had to be perfect because a failed seam meant wet feet meant frostbite. The quality of your moccasins literally determined whether you kept your toes. So a skilled wife or a relationship with someone who could make proper moccasins was survival infrastructure. Men without access to good moccasins struggled and often suffered permanent foot damage. Traps were the core business equipment. Steel leg-hold traps weighing 4 or 5 pounds each. A trapper might carry a dozen or more. Setting them required specific knowledge. You waded into icy water, often breaking through surface ice. Place the trap just below water level near beaver runs or dens. Secured it with a chain to a stake or heavy rock so the beaver couldn't escape. Baited it with castoreum, a secretion from beaver glands that you'd harvested from previous catches. Then you left it for days or weeks. Check your trap line regularly. Miles of walking in deep snow to visit each trap location. The physical toll was enormous. Your legs constantly wet. Hours in freezing water up to your knees or higher. This is why so many mountain men suffered lower extremity damage. Frostbite focused on feet and lower legs because those parts were repeatedly soaked and frozen. The traps themselves required maintenance. Frozen springs would break. Rust would seize mechanisms. You'd work on traps by firelight, oiling and repairing them. This gear wasn't advanced by modern standards, just simple machines. But they had to work perfectly in conditions that destroyed most metal objects. Salt and mineral buildup from constant water exposure. Thermal stress from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Physical stress from struggling animals. Mountain men became blacksmiths by necessity, learning to repair and modify their traps, carrying small files and metal punches, knowing which river rocks could serve as makeshift anvils. The rifle was status and survival combined. Usually a flintlock. Percussion caps came later and weren't always available in remote areas. Long barrel for accuracy. Large caliber because you might need to stop a grizzly. These rifles were works of art, hand-built by gunsmiths in Pennsylvania or Kentucky before mass production. Each one slightly different, idiosyncratic. You learned your rifle's personality, how it shot in cold versus warm weather, how humidity affected accuracy, which loads worked best for different game. A mountain man and his rifle had a relationship, almost literally. He named it sometimes. Know its quirks better than he knew most people, because his life depended on that knowledge. A misfire or misshot could mean starvation, or being killed by something you failed to kill first. Powder horns held gunpowder, made from actual cattle or buffalo horns, hollowed out, plugged, and fitted with a measuring spout. These had to be absolutely waterproof. Wet powder was useless, so mountain men sealed them with beeswax and checked them obsessively. Carried them under coats to keep them warm and dry. A good powder horn could last indefinitely. There are examples in museums that are 200 years old, still functional, still watertight. built to last because replacement wasn't always possible. Then there were the small things that don't survive in museums but mattered enormously. Leather patches for rifle balls, strips of rawhide for emergency repairs, bone awls for punching holes in leather, animal bladders for waterproof storage, sinew for thread that was stronger than plant fiber, bear grease for waterproofing and rust prevention. Each item represented knowledge, knowing what to carry and what to leave behind, what was essential versus what was comfort. Weight was always a consideration. You could only carry so much. Every pound mattered when you were walking miles through snow. So gear selection was strategic. What would keep you alive versus what would make life easier? Survival always won that calculation. But the definition of survival included mental health. So some men carried small luxuries. A book, a harmonica, a photograph. Items that weighed almost nothing but provided psychological comfort worth more than their physical mass. These objects tell stories that journals don't, about what people valued, what they couldn't live without, literally and figuratively. Your own possessions right now. What would you grab if you could only carry 10 pounds? What objects represent your survival? Phone probably. Wallet maybe. But not a knife you've maintained for years. Not moccasins custom-made for your feet. Not a rifle you know intimately. Your survival doesn't depend on objects you maintain. It depends on systems you access. Infrastructure you'll never touch. That's progress. Real, meaningful progress. But also loss. The loss of intimate relationship with the tools that keep you alive. Let yourself sink deeper now. Surrounded by objects you barely notice. That require nothing from you. No maintenance. No understanding. Just utility. Silent. Reliable. Invisible. As you drift further into comfort. Built by hands you'll never see. Using knowledge you'll never need. The way you sleep right now is probably killing you. Not literally, you're fine. But if you were transported to 1835 Wyoming in that position, you'd be hypothermic in 2 hours. Because modern people sleep for comfort. Mountain men slept for heat retention. And those are completely different things. Let's start with your current position. You're probably sprawled, arms and legs extended, maybe one leg kicked out from under the covers. Face up or face down with your head turned, taking up as much space as your bed allows. This is terrible for heat retention. Every extended limb is a heat radiator. Every exposed surface is losing warmth to the environment. You're maximizing your surface area to volume ratio, which is exactly what you want when you're too warm, and exactly wrong when you're trying not to freeze. Mountain men slept in what's called the fetal position, but more extreme. Knees pulled tight to chest, arms wrapped around knees or tucked against torso. Head ducked down, chin to chest. Sometimes hands tucked into armpits. The whole body curled into the smallest possible ball. This minimizes exposed surface area. Reduces heat loss by up to 30% compared to sleeping sprawled. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between maintaining core temperature and sliding into hypothermia. Your face positioning mattered too. Breathing creates moisture. That moisture freezes on beards, on buffalo robes, on anything it touches. So you'd pull the robe partially over your face, creating a small pocket of air that your breath would warm. You're essentially making a microclimate around your nose and mouth. The air you breathe out is warm and humid. The air you breathe in is slightly less cold because it's been warmed by previous breaths. It's not comfortable. Feels claustrophobic. Your face gets damp from condensation. But it works. Modern sleep advice tells you to keep your room cool and sleep exposed. That cool air promotes better sleep quality. That's true when you have temperature control and warm blankets. It's deadly when you don't. Mountain men slept hot when they could, right next to the fire, as close as they could get without actually burning. The fire would die down through the night, but thermal mass and heated rocks or coals would continue radiating warmth for hours. Your modern bed is engineered for even temperature distribution and pressure point relief. Mountain men slept on frozen ground with a single buffalo robe underneath. The ground would literally pull heat from your body through conduction, so you minimize contact with the ground. Sometimes they'd lay branches or pine boughs underneath the robe, creating an air gap between body and earth. That air gap was insulation. Trapped air is one of the best insulators available. Modern sleeping pads work on the exact same principle, just with fancy materials instead of sticks and grass. There is also the question of what to do with your arms. Modern people sleep with arms wherever feels comfortable, stretched out, wrapped around pillows, dangling off the bed. Mountain men kept their arms inside the warmth envelope, either crossed over their chest, or tucked tight against their sides, or wrapped around their knees in that fetal curl. Because extended arms lose heat fast, and frostbitten fingers mean you can't set traps or fire a rifle. So you protect your hands obsessively. Even while sleeping, breathing patterns change too. Slow, shallow breaths through the nose rather than deep breathing through the mouth. Mouth breathing expels more warm, moist air. Nose breathing retains more heat and moisture. This isn't something you consciously think about, but your body learns after enough cold nights. Adapts breathing patterns automatically during sleep. Modern people take huge, deep breaths while sleeping. Our bodies assume temperature is stable, that we can afford to exchange lots of air without thermal cost. Mountain men's bodies learned that assumption was fatal, so they breathed minimally during sleep, just enough oxygen to maintain function. Nothing wasted. Partners sleeping together had their own position optimization. The spoon position, front to back, curled together, became standard. Both people in fetal position, one pressed against the other's back. This minimizes the exposed surface area for both people. Each person has roughly half their body insulated by the other person's body. The math works out to significant heat retention, maybe 15% better than sleeping side by side. There was also rotation through the night. The person on the outside, more exposed to cold air, would eventually get too cold. They'd wake their partner. Swap positions. Now the formerly warm person takes the cold side. The formerly cold person gets the warm position and a chance to reheat. This happened multiple times per night. Nobody got a full, uninterrupted night's sleep. But both people survived until morning. That's the trade-off. Comfort versus survival. Modern culture has eliminated that trade-off for most of us. We get both. Comfortable sleep positions and survival. Because our environment is controlled. But mountain men had to choose. And they chose survival every single time. Some of these sleep positions cause problems. Sleeping curled tight for months can affect flexibility, create chronic muscle tension. Sleeping on frozen ground caused joint problems that persisted for life. But the alternative was not waking up at all. So you accepted the long-term damage, traded future mobility for present survival. Another cost that doesn't show up in romantic frontier stories. There's also the psychological component of sleep position. The fetal position is instinctive during stress. It's protective. Vulnerable organs protected by curled limbs. Mountain men sleeping this way every night reinforced a constant low-level stress response. Their bodies never fully relaxed, never achieved the deep, restorative sleep that comes from feeling completely safe. Because they weren't completely safe, ever. And their sleep positions reflected that reality. Modern sleep research shows that sleep position affects sleep quality, that certain positions promote better rest than others. Mountain men couldn't afford to care. They slept however kept them warmest. Quality was secondary to quantity, and quantity was whatever you could get between fire, tending shifts, and false dawns and cold that woke you no matter how tired you were. Feel your own position now, however you're lying. Arms wherever they fell. Legs extended or bent according to comfort, not calculation. Face exposed to air that won't freeze your breath. Space around you that you take for granted. The luxury of sleeping for comfort rather than survival. Of letting your body sprawl. Of breathing deeply without cost. Let yourself sink deeper into that luxury. Feel how you don't have to curl. Don't have to protect. Don't have to calculate surface area or heat loss. You just get to rest. Fully. Completely. In whatever position feels good. Because your warmth doesn't depend on your geometry. It's just there. Always there. As you drift deeper still. Uncurled. Undefended. Safe. Humans are tribal animals. We survive better in groups. This isn't philosophy, it's biology. And nowhere was this more evident than in mountain man winter camps. When dozens of trappers gathered for extended periods, something interesting happened. The whole became greater than the sum of its parts. Let's talk about the winter rendezvous. Not the famous summer gatherings, those were business. These were survival camps, places where 20, 30, sometimes 50 men would cluster for weeks or months during the worst weather. Usually in a sheltered valley, near water and timber, somewhere they could hunker down and wait out January and February, the coldest, deadliest months. The camps weren't random collections of individuals. They were organized systems, informal but effective. Each partnership, remember, men worked in pairs, would build their own shelter. But the shelters clustered close, within shouting distance, sometimes within 20 feet of each other. This created a microenvironment, multiple fires burning, heat reflecting between shelters, windbreaks overlapping and reinforcing each other. The temperature in the center of a large camp could be 10 degrees warmer than 50 yards away in open terrain. That seems small. It's enormous. 10 degrees is the difference between brutal and merely uncomfortable, between constant misery and occasional comfort. The fires themselves were coordinated. Not consciously, there was no camp manager, but through natural cooperation. One fire starts to die, someone from a nearby shelter adds wood. Not out of pure altruism, but because everyone benefits from keeping multiple heat sources active. If your fire goes out in the night, you can rebuild from coals borrowed from a neighbor. That safety net, knowing you're not completely dependent on your own fire, reduces anxiety, lets people sleep more deeply, which improves decision-making and physical health. Food sharing happened naturally too. One partnership kills an elk. More meat than two men can eat before it spoils. They share. Next week, different hunters make a kill. They reciprocate. No formal accounting. Just the understanding that generosity creates obligation, and obligation creates security. This only works in groups where reputation matters, where you'll see these people again, where being stingy or dishonest has social costs. Winter camps created exactly that environment. You couldn't leave, couldn't storm off and camp elsewhere. You were stuck with these people for weeks. So cooperation became self-enforcing. The social dynamics were fascinating. Hierarchies emerged based on competence and experience. The best hunters had status. The best weather predictors had influence. Men who made poor decisions lost standing quickly. But it wasn't rigid. A man who failed at hunting might excel at equipment repair or fire management. Everyone contributed something. Everyone had value within a group economy. This is completely different from modern individualism. We're taught that your worth comes from personal achievement, that you should be able to succeed alone. That depending on others is weakness. Mountain man camps operated on opposite principles. Your worth came from your contribution to group survival. Depending on others wasn't weakness, it was sanity. Trying to do everything alone was the weakness, the stupidity that got you killed. There were stories around fires every night. Not just entertainment, though they were that too, but information transfer. One man describes where he found beaver 3 valleys over. Another explains a new trap-setting technique. Someone shares observations about weather patterns. A Native American wife explains which plants are safe to eat in spring. This was collective knowledge building. Wikipedia around a campfire. Everyone adding what they knew. Everyone learning from everyone else. The men who survived longest were the ones who listened and learned, who absorbed techniques from multiple sources, who could integrate Shoshone knowledge with French-Canadian methods with their own innovations. Those who insisted on doing things only their way, whether from stubbornness or pride, tended not to last. There was also psychological support, though no one would have called it that. Men suffering from what we now call depression or PTSD, missing families, traumatized by violence they'd witnessed, struggling with the isolation and hardship. In the group camp, they had distraction, company, the feeling that they weren't alone in their suffering. Dark humor helped. Complaints shared and amplified became comedy instead of despair. One man's frostbite horror story becomes a competition of who has it worse, which sounds toxic but actually functioned as group therapy, normalizing suffering, making it bearable through shared experience. Modern men are taught not to do this. to process emotions individually or with professionals. That's probably healthier in many ways, but it requires infrastructure, therapists, time, money, privacy. Mountain men had none of that, so they processed trauma collectively, through stories and jokes and the implicit understanding that everyone was barely holding it together. And somehow that worked. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but well enough that most made it through. Conflict happened too, obviously. Confined spaces, limited resources, men under extreme stress. Fights broke out, sometimes physical, but usually not lethal, because killing someone in winter camp created massive problems. You had to live with the body until spring, or drag it out into a blizzard, which was its own horror. And you'd lose the social standing and cooperation that kept you alive. So camp culture developed conflict resolution mechanisms, ritualized fights that let men blow off steam without permanent damage. Mediators, usually older, respected trappers, who'd step in before things escalated. Shame for anyone who disrupted camp harmony. Social pressure, maintaining cooperation, even when individuals wanted to fight. This required emotional regulation that modern culture doesn't teach. We're taught to express our feelings, stand up for ourselves, not tolerate disrespect, all of which would get you frozen out of a winter camp, literally and figuratively. Mountain men learned to swallow anger, tolerate people they disliked, cooperate with men they wouldn't choose to associate with, because survival demanded it. There's debate among historians about whether these camps were proto-democratic, everyone having roughly equal status, decisions made collectively, or whether they were hierarchical with informal leaders. The answer is probably both. Egalitarian in theory, because everyone's suffering was equal. Hierarchical in practice, because competence created natural leadership. But the hierarchies were fluid, based on demonstrated ability rather than birth or wealth. A 20-year-old who could consistently predict weather had more influence than a 40-year-old who couldn't. Merit-based authority that shifted as circumstances changed. Modern organizations spend millions trying to create this dynamic. Mountain man camps achieved it naturally, because the cost of getting it wrong was death. When spring came, camps dissolved. Men scattered back to their trap lines or moved to different regions. The social structure that had sustained them through winter evaporated. Some men found this difficult, had grown dependent on the group dynamic, struggled with isolation after months of community. Others relished the return to independence, had tolerated the group only because they had to. But almost all of them would return to group camps the following winter, because however much they valued independence, they valued survival more. And survival, in the coldest months, required the group. Feel your own isolation now. You're probably alone in your room. Or, if others are near, they're not necessary for your survival. You could be completely alone and be fine. Your heating system doesn't need tending by shifts. Your food doesn't require group hunting. Your shelter stands whether anyone else is near. You have independence that mountain men couldn't imagine. The freedom to be completely alone without risk. That's unprecedented in human history, and maybe lonely in ways we don't fully recognize. But tonight, it's just comfortable, safe, as you drift deeper into solitary warmth, needing no one, perfectly, completely alone. Every year, people die in the mountains. Well-equipped people, experienced hikers with GPS and Gore-Tex and emergency beacons. They die in conditions mountain men considered merely annoying. This isn't because modern people are weaker, though we probably are. It's because modern gear creates dangerous confidence. You believe your equipment will save you, and when it doesn't, you have no backup plan. Let's start with the obvious failure point. Batteries. Everything modern runs on batteries. Your phone with its GPS and weather apps and emergency contact capability. Your headlamp. Your satellite communicator. Your hand warmers if you bought the rechargeable kind. Batteries die fast and cold, not gradually, catastrophically. A phone that shows 50% charge at room temperature might die in minutes at 20 degrees. The lithium chemistry just stops working in extreme cold. Mountain men had no batteries. Their gear worked the same in any temperature. A flint and steel at -40 performs identically to one at 70 degrees. A buffalo robe doesn't need charging. This isn't nostalgia, it's engineering reality. Simpler systems have fewer failure points. Modern synthetic insulation is another weak point. Those puffy jackets work beautifully when dry. Get them wet and they collapse. Lose 80% of their insulating value. The synthetic fibers mat together. Stop trapping air. Stop working. You're suddenly wearing a wet, cold shell that's doing nothing except making you colder. Down is even worse. Down jackets are warmer than synthetic when dry, but catastrophically bad when wet. Down feathers absorb water and clump into useless lumps. A wet down jacket is worse than no jacket at all because it's heavy and cold and prevents you from moving efficiently. Buffalo robes, by contrast, shed water. The natural oils in the hide and fur make them somewhat water-resistant, not waterproof. Nothing is completely waterproof in sustained wet conditions, but resistant enough that light snow or brief wetness doesn't destroy their function. They continue insulating even when damp. Not as well as when dry, but substantially better than collapsed synthetic fill. Modern boots are another failure point that surprises people. High-tech boots with Gore-Tex liners and synthetic insulation and aggressive tread. They work great for day hikes. They fail in sustained cold weather camping. The Gore-Tex membrane can't breathe when it's frozen, so moisture from your feet gets trapped inside. Your socks get damp. Damp socks conduct heat away from your feet. Your feet get cold and stay cold even though you're wearing expensive boots. Moccasins don't have this problem. They breathe naturally because they're just leather. They get wet from the outside, but they dry relatively quickly by a fire. And you can modify them, stuff them with grass, wrap them in additional leather, whatever the situation demands. They're adaptable in ways that manufactured boots aren't. GPS is wonderful until it isn't. Satellites don't care if you're cold, but receivers do. The screen becomes hard to read in direct sunlight on snow. The touch interface stops working when you're wearing gloves. The battery dies, as we discussed. And if you've been relying entirely on GPS, you probably haven't been paying attention to terrain features or developing any sense of direction. Mountain men navigated by landscape reading. They knew where they were by observing drainage patterns and ridge lines and the shape of valleys. Skills that can't fail because they're in your head, not a device. Emergency beacons are fantastic technology. Press a button and rescue comes. Except rescue in wilderness can take hours or days. And the beacon doesn't keep you warm while you wait. Doesn't make fire or shelter. Just signals that you need help. Mountain men had no rescue coming. They had to solve their own problems, which meant they were better at not creating problems in the first place. More conservative in their risk assessment. More careful in their preparation. Because failure had no backup. Modern gear also creates weight problems. You can carry so many safety items that your pack becomes unmanageably heavy. Extra batteries, backup devices, redundant systems. All of which might be useful, but also slow you down. Make you less mobile. More likely to get caught in bad situations because you're moving slower. Mountain men carried almost nothing that didn't have multiple uses. Their knife was weapon, tool, and eating utensil. Their buffalo robe was blanket, shelter material, and pack cover. Their possibles bag contained only absolute essentials. Total weight of everything they carried, maybe 30 pounds including rifle and ammunition. Modern backpackers often carry 40 to 60 pounds. More comfort, but less mobility. The psychological failure is perhaps most dangerous. Modern people enter wilderness believing technology will protect them. That if something goes wrong, their gear or their beacon or their phone will save them. This creates risk tolerance that's genuinely dangerous. People push into conditions they shouldn't because they feel protected. Then when gear fails, and it will eventually fail, they're in situations they're not equipped to handle mentally or physically. Mountain men had no illusions of protection. They knew they were fragile. That cold could kill them. That injury far from help meant probable death. So they were cautious, conservative, boring even. They didn't take unnecessary risks because there was no safety net. That caution kept them alive. Every year, there are news stories. Experienced climbers dying on mountains they'd climbed before because conditions changed, or gear failed, or batteries died at the wrong moment. And their experience was with the gear, not with the conditions. They knew how to use their equipment. They didn't know how to survive without it. Mountain men were the opposite. Their equipment supported skills they'd already mastered. If they lost their flint and steel, they could make fire with a bow drill. If they lost their knife, they could knap stone into cutting tools. If they lost their rifle, they could make deadfall traps. The skills were primary. The gear was secondary. We've inverted that completely. Gear is primary. Skills are optional. And when gear fails, we have nothing. This isn't an argument against modern equipment. Modern gear is objectively superior when it works. Lighter, more efficient, more comfortable. But it's created dependency that our ancestors would have recognized as dangerous. We've traded resilience for efficiency, robustness for optimization. It's probably a good trade in aggregate. Modern people have better survival rates than mountain men did. We have rescue services and communication and supply chains. The system works until it doesn't. And in that moment, when you're alone and cold and your phone is dead and you realize no one is coming, you trade all your modern gear for the knowledge mountain men carried in their heads. The knowledge that's been lost because we didn't need it. Until suddenly we do. Feel your own dependence now. On electricity flowing through walls. On natural gas or heating oil you've never seen. On systems you don't understand maintaining your comfort. It's working perfectly right now, and probably will tomorrow, and the day after. The system is reliable. Until it isn't. But tonight it is. So let yourself trust it. Sink deeper into dependence. On technology and infrastructure and other people's knowledge. It's holding you, keeping you warm, as you drift further into sleep that requires nothing from you. No skill, no knowledge, just faith that the systems will keep working. As they have, as they will, probably. They still exist. Not many, but they're out there, living deliberately in conditions most of us would consider impossible. Not for money, there's no fair trade anymore. Not for fame, most avoid publicity, but for reasons that might help us understand what was lost and what might still be worth preserving. Dick Proeniek is probably the most documented modern mountain man. Moved to Alaska in 1968. Built a cabin by hand with hand tools. Live alone for 30 years in conditions that regularly dropped to 40 below. He filmed his life, grainy footage that's now preserved. You can watch him split logs with a hand adze. See him process food and maintain his shelter. Observe techniques that would have been familiar to trappers from 1830. What's striking about the footage isn't the hardship. It's the competence. The calm, methodical way he approaches problems. A door hinge breaks. He doesn't panic or call for rescue. He heats metal in his fire, shapes it on a stone anvil, creates a new hinge. Takes hours. Works perfectly. His journal entries describe cold nights in language remarkably similar to mountain man journals from 140 years earlier. The same observations about fire management. The same notes on animal behavior. The same matter-of-fact acceptance of discomfort. Proeniek proved something important, that the skills didn't die with the fur trade era. They're still learnable, still applicable, still sufficient for survival if you have the knowledge and will. Heimo Korth is another. Lives in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with his wife. One of the last people with permission to live year-round in that protected area. He trapped for subsistence, not profit. Generates most of his own food through hunting and fishing. His shelter is more sophisticated than what mountain men had, modern materials and tools. But his daily life would be recognizable to them. Checking trap lines on snowshoes. Processing animals for food and hide. Maintaining gear constantly. Reading weather from sky and animal behavior. In interviews, Korth describes the psychological aspects of winter isolation. The darkness that lasts months. The silence that can feel oppressive or peaceful depending on your mindset. The absolute requirement for mental discipline. He talks about modern people who visit and can't handle it. Even for a few days. They panic. Not from actual danger, but from the absence of stimulation and connection they're addicted to. Their nervous systems can't handle real silence anymore, can't tolerate being alone with their own thoughts. Mountain men never had that problem because they never had the alternative. Modern people who try to go back discover dependencies they didn't know they had. There are a few others scattered across Alaska and northern Canada. People living genuinely off-grid, not weekend wilderness enthusiasts. People who've opted out of modern systems almost entirely. Most are older now, in their 60s and 70s, and there's no younger generation replacing them, because the conditions that created mountain men no longer exist. The economic incentive is gone. The cultural support is gone. The tolerance for hardship is gone. You can't just decide to become a mountain man anymore. There's nowhere to go that isn't regulated. No frontier where you can simply stake a claim and live. The entire planet has been parceled into jurisdictions with rules and requirements. Even Alaska requires permits and compliance. You can't escape bureaucracy anymore. Can't disappear into wilderness the way men did in the 1820s. The last real mountain men are grandfathered into systems that won't persist beyond their lifetimes. When they die, that way of life effectively dies with them. Not just the lifestyle, the knowledge. Dick Proeniek filmed his techniques, which is remarkable. But you can't learn from film what you learn from years of practice. The subtle calibrations, the intuitive understanding that develops after thousands of repetitions. That knowledge takes mentorship to transfer. And there are almost no mentors left, and almost no one seeking that particular mentorship. There are survival schools, obviously, places that teach wilderness skills for recreation or emergency preparedness. But that's different. They're teaching skills to use occasionally, not skills to live by constantly. The psychological adaptation that made mountain men different can't be taught in a weekend course. It requires sustained immersion, months or years of living the life until your nervous system recalibrates. Nobody's doing that anymore. Nobody needs to. Some anthropologists argue this is pure loss, that we've severed humanity's connection to environments we evolved in, that modern people are psychologically damaged by disconnection from natural hardship and challenge, that we need some form of meaningful struggle to be fully human. Others argue it's pure gain, that suffering wasn't noble or character building. It was just suffering, and we're better off having eliminated it. That anyone romanticizing frontier hardship should try living it before philosophizing about it. Both perspectives have truth, but they're really arguing about values, not facts. The fact is simply that a specific way of life and the knowledge that supported it are vanishing. Whether that's good or bad depends on what you value. Comfort and safety? Then it's unquestionably good. Capability and self-reliance? Then it's potentially problematic. Connection to human heritage and evolutionary context? Then it's genuinely tragic. There's no objective answer, just choices about what kind of life we want and what we're willing to sacrifice for it. The last mountain men aren't making political statements. They're just living how they choose to live, finding meaning in competence and self-sufficiency and the satisfaction of meeting their own needs. But they're also testaments, proof that humans can still do what our ancestors did, that the capacity hasn't been bred out, just made unnecessary by civilization. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps knowing it's still possible is sufficient, even if almost no one chooses it. The knowledge exists in books and films and the memories of elderly men in remote cabins. If we ever needed it again, if systems failed dramatically and permanently, we could theoretically recover it, relearn what we've forgotten. Probably. Maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe some knowledge, once lost, is gone forever. Not the facts, those can be recorded, but the embodied understanding that comes only from living it. The way your body knows how to respond to cold when you've felt it thousands of times. The way your mind stays calm in isolation when you've survived it before. That can't be recorded, only experienced. And the opportunities for that experience are vanishing. Let yourself feel the comfort of not needing to know any of this, of living in a world where these skills are curiosities, not necessities, where you can admire the last mountain man from a distance, appreciate their capability without wanting to emulate it, That's privilege, too. The privilege of spectating, of finding it interesting rather than essential. As you sink deeper into comfort they'll never know, warmth that requires nothing, safety that costs you nothing, sleep that comes easy, because you live in a world they left behind, or that left them behind, depending on your perspective. Either way, you're here, and they're there, and the distance between is comfortable, warm, safe, as you drift, further still, into sleep that asks nothing of you, except surrender, to comfort, to systems, to the modern world. That works. For now. Let everything settle now. All those stories of cold and survival, of men who endured what we can barely imagine. Let them drift into the background. Because you're not there. You're here, in your warm bed, in your safe room, where the temperature never changes unless you want it to, where comfort isn't earned through suffering. It's just available. Feel the weight of your blanket. However much it weighs, it's enough. You don't need 20 pounds of buffalo hide. Don't need to worry if it's properly cured or oiled. Your blanket just works. Simple, reliable, warm. Feel the pillow supporting your head. You don't have to bundle clothing or use a saddle or rest on frozen ground. Your head is cradled, comfortable, exactly the right height. The mattress beneath you isn't earth that pulls heat from your body. It's engineered to support and insulate, to cradle every part of you evenly. You're not curled tight in fetal position, minimizing heat loss. You can sprawl, stretch out, take up space, because your warmth doesn't depend on your geometry. It's just there, constant. Your breathing is easy, deep. You don't have to breathe shallowly through your nose to conserve heat. You can breathe however feels natural. The air entering your lungs is perfectly temperate, not cold enough to hurt, not so warm it's stifling. Just right. Your face is exposed to air that won't freeze your breath into ice crystals on your beard. You can let your face relax completely. No need to pull covers over your nose. No need to create a breathing pocket. Just rest. Open. Safe. Your hands and feet are warm. All 10 fingers, all 10 toes present and functional. No numbness creeping in. No frostbite threatening tissue. Your extremities are perfectly fine. Will be perfectly fine tomorrow and the day after. No damage accumulating. No price being paid in flesh. You're not alone in the desperate sense. Not depending on a partner to keep fire alive. Not pressed against another body for survival heat. You have solitude. Peaceful solitude. The kind that's a choice, not a death sentence. You can be alone because alone is safe for you. Comfortable even. There's no fire to tend. No wood to feed carefully through the night. No shifts to maintain. No waking every 2 hours to check if flames are dying. Your heat is automatic, managed by thermostats and systems you'll never see. Working quietly, invisibly, perfectly. There's no wind pressing against your shelter. No blizzard testing your construction. No cold trying to find gaps in your defenses. Your walls are solid, insulated. Between you and weather is engineering built by thousands of people over decades, protecting you without requiring anything from you. You don't have to know how it works. Don't have to maintain it. Don't have to understand the systems keeping you alive. They just work, and you just receive that gift. Passive, comfortable, safe. All those mountain men and their suffering. All that knowledge and skill and hard-won competence. You don't need any of it, not even a little. And that's wonderful. That's progress. That's the whole point of civilization. To make survival easy. To eliminate the constant threat. To create spaces where humans can simply be. Without fighting. Without calculating. Without enduring. You get to just exist. In comfort that would have seemed miraculous to anyone before the 20th century. Warmth without fire. Light without flame. Safety without vigilance. It's almost magic. Except it's not magic. It's engineering and infrastructure and collective human effort. Millions of people you'll never meet maintaining systems that keep you comfortable. Their work, their knowledge, creating your ease. You're held by invisible hands, supported by invisible systems, warmed by invisible processes. And you don't have to think about any of it. You can just sink deeper into the comfort. Let your muscles release completely. No need to stay curled. No need to protect anything. Your body can be loose. relaxed, heavy, melting into the mattress that supports you perfectly. Your breathing can slow, deepen, each breath easier than the last. No effort required, just automatic, natural. Your mind can let go of those frontier stories. The cold and suffering and survival. They're interesting, educational even, but not relevant to you. Not tonight, not ever, probably. You live in a different world, a softer world, a kinder world, where warmth is a right, not a privilege earned through endurance, where comfort is default, not luxury, where survival is automatic, not achievement, and you get to simply drift into sleep that requires nothing from you. No vigilance, no calculation, no suffering, just surrender to comfort, to warmth, to the easy, gentle pull of sleep. Let yourself go deeper now, deeper still, into darkness that's safe, into silence that's peaceful, into sleep that's restful. Your body knows it's safe. Your nervous system can fully relax because there's no threat, no cold creeping closer, no danger approaching, just warmth, steady warmth, holding you, keeping you as you drift further and further into sleep, deep sleep, the kind of sleep mountain men rarely got, the kind that restores completely, heals everything, prepares you for tomorrow, which will be easy, like today was easy, like every day is for you, because you live in the warmth. Always. You're safe. You're comfortable. You're warm. And you can let go completely now. Let everything settle. Let sleep take you, gently, completely, into dreams if they come, or just darkness if they don't. Either way, you're safe. Perfectly safe. As you drift away, into the warmth, into the comfort, into sleep, deep, peaceful, complete, sleep, sweet dreams.